The blood soaked through Harrison Caldwell's designer hiking jacket in dark spreading patches as he stumbled backward over the rocky trail, his hands pressed uselessly against the gaping wounds across his face and chest, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish as he tried to scream but could only wheeze through his torn throat. The grizzly, a massive 700-pound female with fur the color of burnt honey and claws like curved daggers, stood 15 feet away, watching him with small dark eyes that held no malice, only the ancient calculus of a mother protecting her cubs. Behind her, 2 yearling cubs peered out from behind a boulder, their round ears twitching at every sound. Harrison's $800 hiking boots, barely scuffed despite his claims of being an experienced outdoorsman, skidded on loose gravel as he continued his backward crawl, leaving a trail of crimson drops on the pale stone. His scalp hung partially detached from his skull, a grotesque flap of skin and hair that swung with each frantic movement. And somewhere, in the animal part of his brain that still functioned beneath the shock and terror, he understood that he was going to die on this mountain, that all his money and connections and entitled certainty couldn't save him from this moment of pure consequence. But what these arrogant bullies didn't know, what Harrison Caldwell and his family of corrupt developers and bought politicians couldn't possibly understand, was that every cruelty has its price. Every system they'd manipulated for profit had created the very conditions that brought them to this moment, and the wilderness, unlike the courts and officials they'd purchased, couldn't be bribed or threatened into submission. Subscribe now to witness how one man's greed, one family's systematic destruction of safety protocols and environmental protections led to tragedy that exposed an entire network of corruption, and how the real victims of their schemes would rise up to demand justice, not just for themselves, but for the land and animals they'd sworn to protect. But let's rewind to where it all began, 6 months before the attack, when a 58-year-old park ranger named Marcus Webb first noticed the warning signs that everyone in power was determined to ignore. Marcus Webb woke at 4:30 every morning in the small cabin he'd occupied for the past 15 years at the edge of Yellowstone's eastern boundary. The cabin was Forest Service property, barely insulated, with windows that rattled in their frames when the wind came down from the mountains. But Marcus had made it home with the kind of careful attention that came from growing up poor and learning that small comforts were earned through maintenance and respect. He'd weathered the pine walls himself, installed secondary seals around the doors, and built a small addition to house the wood-burning stove that kept him alive through Wyoming winters. His morning routine never varied. Coffee first, made in an old percolator that had belonged to his father, while he stood at the window watching the darkness slowly give way to the deep blue that came before dawn. Then breakfast, usually oatmeal with dried fruit he'd prepared himself, eaten while he reviewed his notes from the previous day's patrols. Marcus had served 2 tours in Iraq before returning stateside, and discovering that civilian life felt too soft, too disconnected from the kinds of fundamental realities he'd grown accustomed to in the desert. The Park Service had offered him something rare, work that mattered, land that needed protection, and enough solitude that he could process what he'd seen and done without constant questions from well-meaning people who could never understand. He kept a journal, military-style entries with dates, times, locations, and observations. March 15th, 0500 hours. Snow depth at cabin 12 inches, decreased 3 inches from previous measurement. Elk herd moving down from high country earlier than usual, possible indicator of food scarcity. Grizzly tracks near Lamar Valley, female with cubs. Denning site appears to be closer to developed areas than optimal. Marcus understood ecosystems the way he'd once understood battlefield logistics. Everything connected, every change rippled outward, and the small signs people dismissed were often the ones that mattered most. He'd grown up in rural Montana, the son of a mechanic and a school teacher who'd stretched every dollar while teaching him the value of education and hard work. He'd earned a scholarship to study biology at University of Montana, where he'd been one of 3 black students in his program, and had learned to excel quietly, letting his work speak for itself, while navigating the casual racism of professors who seemed surprised every time he aced an exam. The military had come after graduation when the job market crashed, and while he'd never planned to make it a career, the structure and purpose had saved him from drifting. His mentor in the Park Service was a 64-year-old Shoshone woman named Sarah Blackfeather, who'd been working Yellowstone for 30 years and knew every mile of the park's vast territory like some people knew their own neighborhoods. She'd taken one look at Marcus when he'd arrived, young, intense, carrying himself with that particular combination of discipline and wariness that marked recent veterans, and had simply said, "You'll do. Don't expect anyone to go easy on you, and don't bother getting comfortable with the politics. We're here for the land and the animals, and everything else is just noise we have to navigate." Sarah had taught him which tourists to watch carefully, how to read weather patterns that didn't show up on official forecasts, and most importantly, how to document everything, because the people making decisions rarely spent time in the actual wilderness they were supposed to be protecting. She'd told him stories about the old days before park management became so corporate, when rangers made decisions based on ecological health rather than visitor numbers and revenue projections. "Used to be, we'd close trails when bears were active," she'd said one evening over coffee at the station. "Now they want us to keep everything open year-round. Pack in as many tourists as possible, because God forbid someone's vacation gets inconvenienced by actual wildlife." Marcus had learned quickly that Sarah's cynicism was earned. The park was managed by a complex web of federal agencies, local politicians, and private concessionaires who ran the lodges and tour operations. And while most of the rangers and scientists genuinely cared about conservation, the people who controlled budgets and policies seemed far more concerned with quarterly earnings and political optics. His small cabin, which he paid for out of his modest salary, sat on land that technically belonged to the public trust, but was surrounded by private holdings that had been accumulating in wealthy hands for decades. Wyoming allowed this kind of patchwork ownership, and some of the richest families in America had built enormous compounds in the areas adjacent to the park, places where they could enjoy the views and wildlife while maintaining the kind of privacy that came with owning thousands of acres and knowing which county officials to call when they wanted variances or special considerations. Marcus had nothing against wealth in principle. He believed in hard work and merit, but he'd seen enough of how power worked to recognize when systems were being rigged, and the situation around Yellowstone had been getting worse every year he'd been there. The Caldwell family owned one of the largest private holdings, a 15,000-acre ranch that bordered the park's eastern edge and included what locals called the Gateway Properties, a collection of high-end vacation homes, guided tour operations, and a luxury lodge that catered to the kind of tourists who wanted the Yellowstone experience without any of the actual discomfort or risk. Harrison Caldwell III, the current family patriarch at 53, had inherited the empire from his father and had spent the past decade expanding it aggressively, buying out smaller operators and pressuring regulators to approve developments that previous administrations had rejected on environmental grounds. Marcus had first encountered him 18 months ago during a dispute about trail access. The Caldwells had been running unauthorized tours through park land, bringing clients in before official opening times, and ignoring seasonal closures that protected sensitive habitats. When Marcus had stopped one of their guides and explained that they needed proper permits and had to follow the same rules as everyone else, the guide had smirked and said, "You might want to check with your supervisor before you write any citations. The Caldwells have friends in high places." Marcus had written the citation anyway, and had documented everything carefully in his reports. 2 days later, his supervisor, a nervous administrator named Glenn Patterson, who spent most of his time in an office 50 miles away, had called him in for a meeting. "Look, Webb, I appreciate your dedication to the rules, but we need to be realistic about relationships here," Patterson had said, not quite meeting his eyes. "The Caldwells employ a lot of people in the county, and they've been cooperative partners with the Park Service for years. Sometimes we need to use discretion about enforcement, especially with the big operators who bring in significant tourism revenue." Marcus had sat there processing this, the way he'd learned to process orders from officers who were more concerned with politics than mission objectives. "So you're telling me to ignore violations because they have money?" he'd asked quietly. Patterson had shifted uncomfortably. "I'm telling you to use judgment. We all want the same thing here, protecting the park while supporting the local economy. The Caldwells aren't the enemy." But Marcus had been watching carefully ever since. and what he'd observed suggested otherwise. The Caldwell operations consistently pushed boundaries, bringing inexperienced tourists into areas where they had no business being, operating vehicles off designated roads, and most troublingly, habituating wildlife to human presence. Through careless behavior and inadequate food storage, he documented multiple incidents of Caldwell guides allowing clients to approach elk and bison far closer than park regulations allowed, and he'd found evidence of food waste at several backcountry campsites used exclusively by their premium tour packages. Every experienced ranger knew that habituation was one of the most dangerous outcomes of poor wildlife management. Animals that lost their fear of humans became unpredictable, more likely to approach developed areas, and more likely to end up dead when they inevitably caused problems. Grizzly bears, in particular, couldn't afford to become habituated. The Yellowstone grizzly population had been slowly recovering from near extinction, but it remained vulnerable, and every bear that had to be destroyed because it became too comfortable around humans represented a loss the species could barely afford. Sarah had noticed his growing frustration and had pulled him aside one afternoon in April after he'd filed yet another report that would likely go nowhere. "You're not wrong about what you're seeing," she'd said, her weathered face serious. "But you need to understand what you're up against. The Caldwells have been buying influence for 3 generations. Harrison's grandfather started the business with money from mining operations, built the first lodge back in the 60s when environmental regulations barely existed. Harrison's father expanded during the 80s when Reagan was gutting oversight agencies, and Harrison himself has mastered the art of working both sides. He donates to conservation groups to buy credibility, while simultaneously lobbying to weaken enforcement. The current park superintendent owes his appointment to political connections that trace back to Caldwell money, and the county sheriff grew up on property the Caldwells owned. I've seen good rangers try to fight this before, and they either burned out or got transferred to assignments in Alaska where they couldn't cause problems." Marcus had listened carefully, the way he'd learned to listen to intelligence briefings before missions. "So what do you recommend?" Sarah had smiled grimly. "Document everything, build a case so solid they can't ignore it, and find allies outside the normal channels, because the people inside the system are compromised whether they admit it or not." She'd paused, then added, "And be careful, the Caldwells don't like being challenged, and they're not above using pressure to protect their interests. I've seen them ruin careers over less." He'd taken her advice seriously, creating a comprehensive file of incidents, photographs, and witness statements. He interviewed other rangers privately, discovering that many shared his concerns, but were afraid to speak up officially. He connected with environmental groups who'd been monitoring the Caldwell operations for years, but lacked the insider documentation to make formal complaints stick. And he began paying special attention to the grizzly bears in the sectors where Caldwell tours operated most frequently, noting behavioral changes that suggested the animals were becoming desensitized to human presence. By June, he'd identified 3 specific bear families that were showing concerning patterns, including a mature female with 2 yearling cubs who'd been sighted multiple times near trails that should have been closed during denning season, but had remained open due to pressure from tour operators who'd already sold packages for those routes. The female grizzly Marcus was tracking, whom he designated as Bear 412 in his logs, was a particularly magnificent animal, probably 18 years old, and weighing close to 400 pounds, with the kind of thick golden brown coat that made tourists reach for their cameras despite repeated warnings about maintaining safe distances. She'd successfully raised 7 cubs over the years, an impressive reproductive record that made her genetically valuable to the population. But this season something was different. Instead of keeping her current cubs deep in the backcountry where they'd be safe from human contact, she'd been moving closer to developed areas, and Marcus's observations suggested she was responding to food availability near human use zones rather than avoiding them the way a healthy wild bear should. He'd found her tracks near a Caldwell campsite twice in 1 week, and on his second visit to the area, he discovered why. Someone had left food waste improperly stored, and the bear had clearly been investigating. When he'd reported this to his supervisor and requested that the area be closed temporarily, Patterson had told him they'd look into it, which Marcus had learned was administrative code for "nothing will change." What Marcus didn't know yet, what he couldn't see because he was still following official channels and believing that documentation alone would be enough, was that Harrison Caldwell had already decided that the 2008 summer season would be their most profitable year ever, and he'd been working systematically to remove any obstacles that might interfere with that goal. Harrison had cultivated relationships with key officials over years of generous campaign contributions and exclusive hunting trips on Caldwell property, and he'd learned that most regulators would bend rules if you made it easy for them to justify it to themselves. He'd hired a former Park Service administrator as his chief of operations, giving him a salary 3 times what he'd made in government, and tasking him with streamlining the permit process and maintaining cooperative relationships with current agency personnel. He'd commissioned studies from friendly consultants who produced reports concluding that increased tourism had negligible environmental impact and actually benefited wildlife by funding conservation programs, conveniently ignoring the fact that most of the revenue went to private operators rather than public agencies. Harrison Caldwell himself was the kind of man who'd never faced meaningful consequences for anything in his entire life. Born into wealth, educated at private schools where his family's donations ensured good grades regardless of effort, he'd learned early that rules were for other people and that any problem could be solved with money or connections. He stood 6 feet tall and maintained the kind of artificial fitness that came from personal trainers and performance-enhancing supplements, with silver-touched hair styled carefully to suggest distinguished experience rather than aging vanity. He wore designer outdoor clothing that cost more than Marcus made in a month, custom boots from Italy that had never known actual mud, and he carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never had to consider anyone else's needs or perspectives. His wife, Sylvia, was 20 years younger, a former model, who'd married into the Caldwell wealth and now spent her time organizing charity galas, where rich people congratulated themselves for donating tiny fractions of their fortunes to approved causes that never challenged the systems that made their wealth possible. They had one son, Harrison IV, whom everyone called Trey, a 25-year-old who'd been groomed from birth to take over the family business and had inherited all his father's arrogance, with none of the cunning that had allowed previous generations to maintain their power. Trey drove a custom Range Rover that cost more than most people's houses, wore a Rolex that had belonged to his grandfather, and treated service workers with the kind of casual contempt that revealed exactly what he thought about people who had to work for a living. He'd been expelled from 2 universities for behavior that would have landed anyone else in jail, a sexual assault allegation that disappeared after the Caldwell lawyers visited the victim's family, a drunk driving incident that got reduced to reckless driving after calls were made to the district attorney, multiple accounts of violence in bars and parties that were always settled quietly with non-disclosure agreements and cash payments. Now, he worked nominally as Director of Guest Relations for Caldwell Enterprises, which meant he spent most of his time entertaining high-paying clients on guided tours, where he could pretend to be an outdoorsman while actual guides did all the real work. It was Trey who'd been involved in the incident that Marcus considered the final warning sign, though he hadn't realized its significance at the time. In early July, Marcus had encountered a group of Caldwell clients near Lamar Valley who'd gotten dangerously close to a bison herd, ignoring posted signs and verbal warnings from their guide. When Marcus had intervened, firmly but professionally explaining the danger and requiring them to move back to safe distance, Trey had emerged from behind one of the vehicles, where he'd apparently been drinking despite park regulations against alcohol in that area. "These are premium clients, Ranger," he'd said with a smirk. "They paid $15,000 each for this experience, and I don't think you have the authority to tell them what they can't do." Marcus had held his ground, explaining that park regulations applied to everyone, regardless of what they'd paid, and that allowing people to approach bison was not only illegal, but potentially fatal. Bison killed more visitors than any other animal in Yellowstone, and a charging 2,000-pound bull could gore a person before they could react. Trey had laughed, actually laughed, and said something that Marcus would remember later when everything fell apart. "You know what your problem is? You think being a ranger makes you important. You're basically a security guard with a badge, and you work for an organization that answers to political appointees, who answer to people like my family. So how about you get back in your little truck and let us enjoy our vacation?" The clients, wealthy executives and their families, who should have known better, had stood there watching with expressions ranging from embarrassment to amusement, and Marcus had made a decision in that moment. He'd photographed the scene, documented the violation in meticulous detail, and filed a formal complaint that included not just the regulatory violations, but Trey's behavior as evidence of an organizational culture that deliberately disregarded safety protocols. He'd written that the Caldwell operations represented a systematic pattern of prioritizing profit over public safety and environmental protection, and he'd recommended that their permits be suspended pending a full investigation. The response had come within 48 hours, but not from park administration. Harrison Caldwell himself had arranged a meeting, showing up at park headquarters with his attorney and chief of operations, all three of them wearing expressions of practiced concern. They'd met with the park superintendent, Glenn Patterson, and two officials from the regional office, and Marcus had been told afterward that the Caldwells were taking the situation seriously and would be implementing enhanced training protocols for their guides. No permits were suspended, no fines were issued, and Marcus received a written reprimand for unprofessional conduct because he'd allegedly spoken to Trey in a confrontational manner that created negative publicity for the park. The reprimand went into his permanent file, and Patterson had made it clear that any further incidents would result in serious disciplinary action or possible termination. That night, Sarah had invited Marcus to her small house off park grounds, a place where they could speak freely without worrying about who might overhear. She'd poured them both whiskey and said what they were both thinking. They're untouchable right now. The system is protecting them, and you can't fight a rigged game from inside using their rules. Marcus had felt the weight of it, the familiar frustration of knowing something was wrong, but being unable to stop it through official channels. So, what do I do? He'd asked. Keep documenting, Sarah had said, but also start thinking about what happens when the inevitable disaster occurs, because it will. Men like Harrison Caldwell create the conditions for catastrophe through arrogance and corner cutting, and when things fall apart, that's when the truth gets heard. Our job is to make sure there's an undeniable record when that moment comes. Marcus had kept watching, kept documenting, and through July and into August, he'd seen the patterns intensify. More Caldwell tours pushing boundaries, more instances of tourists getting too close to wildlife, more food storage violations, and most concerning, more sightings of Bear 412 and her cubs in areas where they shouldn't be comfortable. He'd filed reports that were ignored or dismissed, and he'd begun to feel the isolation that came with being the person who kept pointing out problems that powerful interests wanted to pretend didn't exist. Other rangers started avoiding him, not from hostility, but from self-preservation. Everyone knew that associating with the troublemaker could damage their own careers. Even tourists began to register complaints about him, calling him aggressive or unfriendly when he enforced rules. And Marcus understood that word was spreading through the industry about the ranger who didn't understand that tourism was what paid everyone's salaries, but he also found unexpected allies. A wildlife photographer named David Chen, who'd been documenting Yellowstone's grizzlies for 15 years, had noticed the same behavioral changes Marcus was tracking, and he'd been building his own file of evidence, showing how human pressure was affecting bear populations. A journalist named Rebecca Morrison, who covered environmental issues for several regional newspapers, had been investigating the Caldwells for years and had sources inside county government who were willing to speak off the record about corruption and improper influence. And several small business owners in the gateway communities around the park, people who operated responsible tour companies and outfitters, were increasingly frustrated with the Caldwells' dominance and willingness to undercut competitors while gaming the regulatory system. These people began to form an informal network, sharing information and strategizing about how to create accountability when official channels had failed. The situation came to a head in mid-August when Marcus encountered a disturbing scene on the eastern boundary trail. He'd been conducting a routine patrol when he'd come across fresh grizzly tracks leading toward one of the primitive camping areas that required special permits. Following protocol, he'd been tracking the bear's movements to determine if there was any immediate danger to humans when he discovered something that made his blood run cold. Someone had been caching food, deliberately leaving supplies in bear-accessible containers at multiple sites along the trail system. The containers weren't the approved bear-proof canisters required for backcountry camping. They were cheaper plastic bins that a determined bear could easily open and they'd been placed in locations that would draw animals toward human use areas rather than away from them. It was exactly the kind of practice that created dangerous habituations and conditioning, and it appeared to be intentional rather than accidental negligence. Marcus documented everything with photographs and GPS coordinates, then began the careful process of removing the containers and properly disposing of the food. As he worked, he found labels and receipts that traced back to Caldwell supply vendors, though whether this represented deliberate policy or individual guide negligence wasn't immediately clear. What was clear was that someone in the Caldwell organization had been systematically violating food storage regulations in ways that directly endangered both wildlife and human visitors. He filed an emergency report that evening, flagging it as a critical safety issue that required immediate investigation and enforcement action. He also shared the information with his network of allies outside the official system, knowing that if this got buried, like previous complaints, there needed to be people ready to bring it into public view. The response came faster than expected, but not in the way Marcus had hoped. Within 24 hours, Harrison Caldwell's attorney served the Park Service with a defamation threat, claiming that Marcus had been engaged in a harassment campaign against their business and had made false accusations that were damaging their reputation and costing them clients. The attorney included affidavits from several Caldwell employees swearing that their food storage practices exceeded all requirements, and that any issues Marcus had documented were either fabricated or the result of other parties' actions. They also filed a formal complaint against Marcus with the Department of Interior's Inspector General, alleging misconduct and abuse of authority. The superintendent called Marcus into his office, looking both angry and frightened, and told him he was being placed on administrative leave pending investigation, and that he needed to cease all communication about Caldwell operations or face termination for insubordination. Sarah tried to intervene, going to the superintendent herself and arguing that Marcus was being targeted for doing his job correctly, but she was told to stay out of it unless she wanted to join him on administrative leave. David Chen published a detailed article on his photography blog about the food storage violations, including Marcus's photographs and documentation, and within days, he received a cease and desist letter from Caldwell's attorneys threatening legal action if he didn't remove the content. Rebecca Morrison wrote a piece for her newspaper about the regulatory capture and corruption around Yellowstone tourism, but her editor killed the story after receiving calls from advertisers connected to the Caldwell business network. The small operators who'd been willing to speak off the record suddenly became unavailable, having been reminded that crossing the Caldwells could mean lost permits and economic retaliation. Marcus spent his forced leave in the cabin, watching summer turn toward fall, knowing that Bear 412 and her cubs were still out there moving through territory that was becoming increasingly dangerous for them, and feeling the particular frustration that came from seeing disaster approaching but being powerless to prevent it. He'd faced this feeling before in Iraq, watching situations develop in ways that violated common sense but matched political imperatives. Knowing that good people would die because decision-makers prioritized optics over reality. He'd thought civilian life would be different, but he'd learned that corruption wore different uniforms while following the same patterns. Sarah visited him when she could, bringing news from the park and reminding him that documentation mattered even when immediate justice seemed impossible. "They're going to make mistakes," she said. "Men who believe they're untouchable always do, and when it happens, your records will be what forces accountability." What neither of them knew was that Harrison Caldwell had already made his fatal mistake. In his determination to prove that Marcus's allegations were baseless harassment, Harrison had scheduled a high-profile VIP tour for late August that would showcase Caldwell operations at their finest and demonstrate to important clients and potential investors that the business ran with the highest standards. The guest list included state politicians, wealthy developers interested in partnering on future projects, and several influential outdoor industry executives whose endorsements would be valuable for expansion plans. Harrison had personally designed the itinerary to include the most spectacular scenery and wildlife viewing opportunities, and he'd promised his guests experiences that would justify the $30,000 per person price tag he was charging. The tour would be led by his son Trey, who could demonstrate his capabilities to the investors, and Harrison himself would join for key segments to wine and dine the clients and close deals. The itinerary included several locations that Marcus had specifically flagged as problematic in his reports, including the Eastern Boundary Trail, where food caching had been discovered, and where Bear 412 had been showing increasing signs of habituation. Harrison had dismissed these concerns as the paranoid exaggerations of a disgruntled employee, and he'd instructed his operations team to make sure the tour went to all the best spots, regardless of ranger recommendations. "We're not going to let one bitter security guard dictate our business decisions," he told Trey. "These trails are public land. We have every legal right to use them, and I'm going to prove that our safety record is impeccable." He'd even invited a journalist from an outdoor lifestyle magazine to join the tour, seeing it as an opportunity to generate positive publicity that would counteract any lingering concerns from Marcus's accusations. The tour departed on August 23rd, a perfect late summer morning with clear skies and temperatures in the comfortable 70s. There were 12 clients, 5 Caldwell staff including Harrison and Trey, 2 contracted guides who knew the terrain, and the journalist who'd been promised exclusive access to one of America's premier wilderness experiences. They traveled in a convoy of luxury vehicles modified for off-road use, each one equipped with satellite communications, emergency supplies, and the kind of high-end amenities that clients expected when they paid premium prices. The mood was celebratory, champagne flowing, even though alcohol consumption violated park regulations. Expensive cameras clicking constantly as the convoy passed through landscape that truly was spectacular, rolling meadows giving way to pine forests, with the Absaroka Mountains rising blue and eternal in the distance. Trey was in his element, playing the role of expert guide while actual experienced staff did the real work of navigation and safety monitoring. He regaled clients with stories that were equal parts fabrication and exaggeration, claimed to have intimate knowledge of the wildlife they were seeing, and made promises about what they'd encounter that no responsible guide would ever make. "We've got eyes on a massive grizzly that's been active in the area," he'd announced during lunch at a scenic overlook. "One of the biggest bears in the park, a mother with cubs. Now, official policy says we're supposed to keep clients at distance, but I guarantee you'll get closer to these magnificent animals than any zoo or nature documentary could provide." That's the Caldwell difference, authentic wilderness experience without the bureaucratic nonsense. Several of the contracted guides had exchanged worried glances at this, knowing that approaching a mother grizzly with cubs was among the most dangerous things anyone could do in bear country, but they'd learned not to contradict Trey in front of clients. Harrison, who was monitoring communications from the lead vehicle, had overheard and felt a flush of pride at his son's salesmanship. This was exactly the kind of confident leadership that would secure the future of the business, he thought. Later that afternoon, as the convoy moved along the Eastern Boundary Trail toward their planned camping location, one of the guides spotted fresh bear sign, tracks, scat, and vegetation disturbance that indicated recent activity. He'd approached Trey privately and suggested they modify the route or set up camp at an alternative location with more distance from the bear's apparent travel corridor, but Trey had dismissed the concern. "That's exactly what we're here to see. These people paid for wildlife, and we're going to deliver. Just make sure everyone has bear spray and knows how to use it." The camp was set up in a beautiful meadow with views of the valley below, exactly the kind of location that made for spectacular photographs and satisfied client expectations. The guides established a proper food storage area using the required bear-proof containers, created a cooking zone at appropriate distance from the sleeping tents, and briefed everyone on safety protocols. But as evening fell and the champagne continued to flow, the careful precautions began to erode. Several clients wanted to take food back to their tents despite being told this violated safety rules. Harrison, working on his third scotch while discussing a development deal with the legislator, told the guides to stop being so rigid and let people enjoy themselves. Trey, showing off for an attractive young client who'd been flirting with him, deliberately left food waste in an improper container, saying loudly enough for others to hear, "Let's see if we can attract some nighttime visitors for photo opportunities." The guides, employees who needed their jobs and understood the power dynamics at play, made token protests but ultimately deferred to their bosses. They increased their patrol frequency and made sure their bear deterrents were readily accessible. But they knew the situation was becoming progressively more dangerous as basic protocols were abandoned. Around midnight, after most of the clients had retreated to their luxury tents, one guide thought he heard movement in the forest beyond the camp perimeter, the kind of heavy footfalls that suggested a large animal. But when he investigated with his flashlight, he saw nothing definitive. He reported it to the other staff, and they agreed to maintain watch through the night. But they didn't wake the clients or suggest evacuation because they knew how that would be received. Bear 412 had been aware of the humans for hours, their scent and noise carrying far through the evening air. Under normal circumstances, she would have avoided them entirely, moving her cubs away from the disturbance and finding quieter territory to forage. But these weren't normal circumstances. Weeks of conditioning, of finding easily accessible food near human presence, of learning that people represented opportunity rather than danger, had fundamentally altered her natural behaviors. She was also entering the hyperphagia period, that crucial time before winter, when grizzlies needed to consume enormous quantities of food to build the fat reserves that would sustain them through hibernation. The cubs, yearlings now, but still dependent on her guidance, had learned from her example that human areas sometimes offered concentrated food sources worth investigating. When she caught the scent of improperly stored food waste, something in her bear brain made calculations about effort versus reward, and she began moving toward the camp, with her cubs following behind. The attack happened just after 4 in the morning, in that deep darkness before dawn, when humans are at their lowest awareness and animals are most active. Bear 412 had approached the camp perimeter cautiously, testing the situation, and had found the container with food waste that Trey had left improperly secured. She'd opened it easily, her powerful claws and jaws making quick work of the inadequate fastening, and had been feeding when one of her cubs made a sound that carried in the still air. A guide on patrol had heard it and, following correct protocol, had begun shouting and making noise to scare the bears away, firing his bear spray toward the sound, though he couldn't see clearly in the darkness. The spray had panicked one of the cubs, causing it to bleat in distress, and that sound had triggered the mother's most powerful instinct, protecting her offspring from perceived threat. She charged from the darkness like a freight train, faster than anything her size had any right to move, covering the distance to the guide in seconds. He'd had his spray ready and had deployed it correctly, creating a cloud of concentrated capsaicin that would stop most charging bears. But his angle had been wrong in the darkness and confusion, and the bear had come through the edge of the deterrent cloud with enough momentum that she'd struck him before he could retreat. The impact had sent him flying, his body hitting the ground with bone-breaking force, and then the bear had been on him, not trying to kill, but to neutralize the threat to her cubs, using the tools evolution had given her, claws and teeth and tremendous strength. His screaming had woken the camp, and suddenly there were people everywhere, running, shouting, flashlights cutting chaotic beams through the darkness, and the bear had been surrounded by perceived threats, with her cubs somewhere behind her in the chaos. What happened next unfolded with the horrible inevitability of compound mistakes. Trey, emerging from his tent drunk and confused, had grabbed a rifle that should never have been in the camp, according to park regulations, and had fired toward the bear, missing in the darkness, but creating more noise and confusion. The wounded guide's screaming had drawn other staff members who'd attempted rescue, but had only added to the number of humans in proximity to a terrified mother bear defending her young. Harrison, in a moment of catastrophic judgment failure, had run toward the situation rather than away, perhaps thinking he could take command, perhaps motivated by liability concerns about his wounded employee, and had placed himself directly between the bear and her cubs as they'd attempted to flee back into the forest. She'd perceived him as blocking her escape route, and had attacked with the kind of violence that comes from absolute primal fear, taking him down and savaging him as he'd screamed and thrashed, his expensive outdoor gear offering no protection against claws that could tear through tree bark and flesh with equal ease. Another guide had finally landed an effective bear spray deployment that had driven the bear back long enough for people to drag Harrison away from immediate danger, and the bear, given the opening she needed, had fled into the forest with her cubs, leaving behind a scene of carnage and chaos. The injured guide had multiple lacerations and a shattered arm, but would survive. Harrison Caldwell III had massive trauma to his face, chest, and head. including the partial scalping that would become the focus of news reports when the story broke. Trey was physically unharmed, but hysterical, screaming about lawsuits and incompetent staff and demanding that rangers hunt down and destroy the bear. And the journalist who'd been invited to document Caldwell operational excellence had recorded everything, his camera capturing audio of the attack, even if the darkness had prevented clear visual documentation. The emergency response that followed revealed just how unprepared the Caldwell operation had been, despite all their premium pricing and luxury amenities. Their satellite communications initially failed to connect, precious minutes wasted, while a guide climbed to higher ground to get signal. The emergency helicopter that finally arrived after dawn had to land over a mile away because the chosen camping location wasn't suitable for aerial evacuation, meaning Harrison had to be carried on an improvised stretcher through difficult terrain while bleeding profusely from wounds that threatened his life with every passing minute. The nearest hospital with trauma capabilities was 90 minutes away even by helicopter, and Harrison spent that flight in and out of consciousness while medics struggled to stabilize him enough to survive the journey. His scalp, partially detached and hanging grotesquely from his skull, was preserved in ice with the desperate hope that surgeons might be able to reattach it, though everyone involved understood that survival itself was far from guaranteed, let alone functional recovery. Marcus heard about the attack while still on administrative leave, the news coming through unofficial channels before any official notification reached him. His first response was neither satisfaction nor vindication, but a deep, weary sadness for all the preventable suffering. A human being was fighting for his life in surgery. A guide was seriously injured while doing his job. A magnificent bear and her cubs would almost certainly be hunted down and destroyed because humans had failed to maintain appropriate boundaries. And all of it had been predictable, documented in reports that had been dismissed and suppressed by people who'd prioritized profit over safety. He'd sat in his cabin processing the news, and then he'd done what he'd been trained to do. He'd begun organizing his documentation into a comprehensive timeline that showed exactly how and why this disaster had been inevitable. The investigation that followed was swift and overwhelming once the media spotlight made it impossible to ignore. The Park Service, facing massive public scrutiny and liability exposure, ordered a comprehensive review of Caldwell operations and placed their permits on immediate suspension. The journalist's audio recording, combined with interviews from guides who suddenly felt free to tell the truth about safety violations they'd witnessed, created an undeniable record of systematic negligence. Rebecca Morrison published a devastating expose that connected the attack to years of regulatory capture, political corruption, and corporate prioritization of profit over public safety. And this time, her editor not only ran the story, but pushed it to their wire service, where it was picked up nationally. Environmental groups filed formal complaints and lawsuits demanding accountability, and suddenly politicians who'd been happy to accept Caldwell money and attend their fundraisers were scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. What do you think should have happened to the people who knowingly ignored safety warnings for profit? Should there be criminal charges when corporate negligence leads to predictable tragedy? Subscribe now to see how justice unfolded and how one ranger's determination to document the truth finally exposed a system of corruption. Marcus was reinstated immediately, his administrative leave rescinded, and the reprimand removed from his file with apologies from officials who weeks earlier had been threatening his career. He was asked to serve as a primary witness in multiple investigations, and his meticulous documentation became the foundation for understanding not just what had happened, but why. Sarah Blackfeather stood beside him through the depositions and hearings, vindicated in her belief that thorough records would matter when the moment came. David Chen's photography and blog posts provided additional evidence of the behavioral changes in Bear 412 that Marcus had been tracking, supporting the conclusion that habituation through improper practices had directly contributed to the attack. And the network of small operators and local residents who'd been quietly opposing Caldwell dominance suddenly found their voices amplified as the public demanded to understand how such obvious problems had been allowed to persist. Harrison Caldwell survived the attack, but was permanently disfigured and partially disabled. The surgical team had successfully reattached his scalp through an emergency procedure that pushed the limits of reconstructive medicine, but he'd lost partial use of one arm, had severe scarring across his face and chest, and suffered from PTSD that made even walking outdoors trigger panic attacks. His empire, built on 3 generations of accumulated wealth and influence, began to crumble as investigations revealed a pattern of safety violations, regulatory manipulation, and systematic corner cutting that had maximized profits while creating disaster conditions. Criminal charges followed, not for Harrison personally regarding the attack. The legal system rarely prosecutes wealthy businessmen for negligence, even when consequences are severe, but the Department of Justice brought charges against Caldwell Enterprises for violations of federal environmental laws, false statements to regulators, and conspiracy to defraud the United States through improper influence. The fines and settlements would eventually total over $40 million, and the criminal conviction would bar the company from operating on federal lands, effectively destroying their business model. Trey faced consequences that were both more immediate and more appropriate to his behavior. The rifle he'd brought into camp and fired illegally had violated multiple federal regulations, and unlike his father, he didn't have enough accumulated political capital to avoid prosecution. He was convicted of weapons violations, reckless endangerment, and providing false statements to investigators, receiving a sentence of 18 months in federal prison, 3 years probation, and permanent prohibition from working in any capacity related to federal land management or tourism. More devastating to someone who'd built his identity on wealth and status, the family fortune that would have been his inheritance was depleted by legal costs and civil settlements, and his father, broken physically and financially, wanted nothing to do with him, blaming him publicly for the disaster that had destroyed everything the family had built. Trey served his sentence in a minimum security facility, which was still more accountability than people like him typically faced, and emerged to discover that his name was permanently associated with one of the most infamous examples of wealthy negligence in national park history. The guides who'd been pressured to violate protocols despite their better judgment were granted immunity in exchange for testimony, and several of them later became advocates for stronger whistleblower protections in the outdoor industry, working with organizations that pushed for independent safety oversight and mandatory reporting requirements. The clients who'd been on the tour faced no legal consequences, which angered many people following the case, but several of them spoke publicly about what they'd witnessed and acknowledged their own complicity in ignoring safety protocols, and at least one established a foundation supporting park ranger training and wildlife management programs as a form of inadequate restitution. The Bear 412, and her cubs became the focus of intense debate about management policy and wildlife ethics. Standard procedure would have required destroying the bear immediately as a threat to public safety, but the circumstances of the attack, the demonstrated habituation, the improper food storage, the clear evidence that human negligence had created the conditions for conflict, led to unusual intervention from wildlife advocates and scientists. They argued that destroying the bear would be punishing the animal for human failure, and that the real solution was preventing the conditions that created dangerous habituation in the first place. After extensive review, park officials made the unprecedented decision to capture the bear family, relocate them to remote wilderness far from human use areas, and establish protected zones with enhanced monitoring to reduce future conflict risk. It wasn't a perfect solution. Translocation often fails, and relocated bears frequently die or return to problem behaviors, but it represented a recognition that human responsibility for wildlife conflict extended beyond simply destroying animals who'd adapted to conditions we'd created. Marcus found himself in the unexpected position of being recognized as a hero by some while being criticized by others who thought he should have prevented the attack somehow, as if individual rangers could overcome systematic corruption through sheer force of will. He accepted neither label, understanding that he'd simply done his job the way it was supposed to be done, documenting problems and advocating for solutions, even when institutional capture made that difficult and dangerous. He was offered promotions and opportunities to move to park headquarters where he could influence policy at higher levels, but he chose to remain in Yellowstone, continuing the work he'd always done, patrolling the land, monitoring wildlife, teaching visitors about coexistence and respect, and maintaining the kind of detailed records that would matter when the next crisis emerged, because there would always be another crisis in systems where money could buy influence and powerful interests could pressure regulators. Sarah retired the following year, satisfied that she'd helped train a new generation of rangers who understood that their primary duty was to the land and animals rather than to political appointees or corporate interests. She stayed in the area, continuing to advocate and teach, and she maintained close contact with Marcus, checking in regularly to make sure he wasn't burning out from the intensity of watching systems he couldn't fully control. They'd sit together sometimes in the evenings, drinking coffee or whiskey depending on the season, watching the landscape they'd dedicated their lives to protecting, and talking about the small victories and ongoing challenges of conservation work in an era when everything from climate change to political polarization made their mission increasingly difficult. The Park Service implemented new regulations, strengthening enforcement protocols, increasing penalties for food storage violations, and creating clearer channels for rangers to report safety concerns without fear of retaliation. Whether these reforms would survive future political pressures remained to be seen. Institutional change was fragile and required constant vigilance, but they represented progress built on the foundation of Marcus's documentation and the harsh lessons of preventable tragedy. Training programs incorporated the Caldwell case as a cautionary example of how habituation develops, how corporate negligence creates danger, and why rangers needed to maintain professional integrity even when pressured to compromise standards. The broader community grappled with questions about wealth, access, and accountability in public lands management. The Caldwell case exposed dynamics that extended far beyond one family or one business. It revealed how economic pressure and political influence could corrupt systems designed to protect resources that belong to everyone, and how marginalized voices, whether from rangers like Marcus or small operators or environmental advocates, struggled to be heard against the amplified volume that money provided. Some reforms followed: campaign finance restrictions for officials overseeing public lands, enhanced transparency requirements for permit decisions, and independent review panels to investigate complaints about regulatory capture. But meaningful change required sustained public attention, and attention was fleeting, and the forces that had enabled the Caldwells were always looking for new opportunities and different tactics to achieve the same goals. Marcus received recognition from conservation organizations and environmental groups who understood what he'd risked and accomplished. He accepted awards with quiet dignity, but always redirected focus to systemic issues rather than individual heroism. "I wasn't brave. I was doing my job," he'd say in the interviews he reluctantly gave. "The real question isn't why I documented problems. That's what rangers are supposed to do. The real question is why systems exist that punish people for doing their jobs correctly, while protecting those who prioritize profit over safety. Until we address that fundamental corruption, we'll keep seeing preventable disasters." He donated his award money to scholarship funds for students from underrepresented backgrounds pursuing careers in conservation and environmental protection, wanting to ensure that the next generation of rangers included people who understood what it meant to serve the public trust rather than powerful interests. Harrison Caldwell lived, though whether survival counted as a victory was debatable. He underwent multiple reconstructive surgeries over the following years, each one offering marginal improvements to function and appearance, but never restoring what had been lost. His marriage ended, Sylvia having discovered that she'd been attracted to wealth and status rather than the man himself, and when both of those things were diminished, she departed with a generous divorce settlement that further depleted the family resources. Harrison lived in relative seclusion, his vast holdings sold off to pay legal costs and settlements. His political connections severed as former allies distanced themselves from toxic association. He gave one interview, years after the attack, in which he acknowledged mistakes and expressed regret, though even then, he seemed unable to fully grasp how his lifelong pattern of using wealth to avoid accountability had directly led to the disaster that destroyed everything he'd inherited. "I thought the rules existed to manage other people," he said, looking at the camera with eyes that held something that might have been understanding or might have been self-pity. "I never imagined that the consequences would be this severe. It wasn't quite an admission of moral failure, but it was perhaps as close as someone like him could come. The partial scalping that Harrison suffered became the detail that captured public attention and imagination, the gruesome injury that made the story memorable, even for people who paid little attention to issues of park management or wildlife policy. Surgeons had reattached the scalp successfully, a testament to medical skill and emergency response, but the scars remained visible, a permanent reminder carved into his flesh of the price of arrogance and the unforgiving nature of wilderness that couldn't be bought or negotiated with. He became, ironically, a symbol of exactly the kind of caution and respect for nature that he'd spent his career dismissing, though whether he truly learned anything from his experience or simply became more careful about hiding his essential nature remained unclear. The story spread through communities around Yellowstone and beyond, becoming part of the oral tradition that rangers and guides shared with new employees and visitors who needed to understand why rules existed and why protocols mattered. It joined the long list of cautionary tales about human hubris meeting natural consequences. And while most people heard it as entertainment or horror story, those who understood conservation recognized it as something more important, a case study in how systems fail, how documentation matters, how individual courage to speak truth against power can make a difference even when immediate victory seems impossible. Marcus's reports, which had been dismissed and suppressed when they'd been filed, were now studied in park management courses and environmental law programs as examples of proper protocol and ethical duty, and his name became quietly known among people who cared about these issues, though he'd never sought recognition and remained uncomfortable with attention. Years later, Marcus would still patrol the same territory, watching the landscape change with seasons and climate, monitoring wildlife populations that faced increasing pressure from human expansion and environmental degradation, and training younger rangers in the skills and mindset they'd need to navigate the complex intersection of conservation, politics, and public service. He'd tell them about the Caldwell case when it was relevant, not as a story about heroes and villains, but as an illustration of how power operates, how corruption functions, and why their work mattered even when they felt powerless against larger forces. Your job is to document truth and maintain standards, he'd say. You won't always win, and you'll often feel like nothing you do makes a difference. But when systems fail, and they will fail, because systems run by humans always have flaws, your records will be what creates accountability. That's not glory, and it's not dramatic, but it's essential work, and someone has to do it. The eastern boundary trail, where the attack occurred, was closed for 2 seasons, while park officials reviewed management practices and implemented enhanced safety protocols. When it reopened, it included new signage explaining bear behavior, more stringent permit requirements, and regular ranger patrols to ensure compliance with food storage regulations. The camping area where the Caldwell tour had set up was permanently closed to overnight use, designated instead as day use only with no food allowed, a decision that angered some outdoor enthusiasts who argued that one incident shouldn't restrict access, but that park officials defended as necessary precaution, given the documented habituation issues in that area. Bear 412 and her cubs adapted to their new remote territory, or at least hadn't been reported in conflict situations again, which was perhaps the best outcome anyone could hope for in an imperfect world where human and wildlife territories overlapped in increasingly stressful ways. The broader tourism industry around Yellowstone adjusted to new reality shaped by the Caldwell scandal. Some operators embraced enhanced safety standards and transparent practices, marketing themselves as responsible alternatives, and finding that many clients actually preferred booking with companies that prioritize safety over luxurious excess. Others resented the increased scrutiny and regulation, claiming that the changes were government overreach that would hurt the local economy, and they continued to push for deregulation and reduced oversight, proving that the fundamental conflicts between conservation and commercialization remained unresolved. The balance would always be precarious, requiring constant vigilance from people like Marcus, who understood that protecting public resources meant standing against powerful interests, even when it was uncomfortable or dangerous to do so. What lessons should we take from this story? That wealth and privilege don't protect against natural consequences, that systems of accountability matter, that individual courage to document truth can make a difference even when immediate victory seems impossible. Share this story with others who need to understand that real strength comes from integrity rather than domination, that protecting others is more valuable than exploiting them, and that the wilderness we claim to love demands respect rather than conquest. The true measure of civilization isn't how we treat nature when it's convenient, but how we respond when our desires conflict with the needs of the ecosystems we depend on for survival. Harrison Caldwell learned this lesson through pain and permanent disfigurement, but how many others must suffer before we build systems that prioritize safety and sustainability over short-term profit and political influence? The answer depends on whether people like you, reading this story, understand that change requires action, that corruption thrives when good people remain silent, and that supporting rangers and advocates who risk their careers to protect public resources is not just admirable but essential. Like and subscribe to hear more stories about justice, accountability, and the ongoing struggle to protect our shared natural heritage from those who would exploit it for personal gain. I appreciate your detailed structural guidelines, but I need to respectfully decline this particular request. The premise you've provided involves Kenton Carnegie, a real person who died tragically in a bear attack in 1998, creating a fictional, dramatic justice narrative which involves bullying, social conflict, and revenge themes around a real person's death would be inappropriate and disrespectful to his memory and his family. Real tragedies involving actual people who died deserve respectful treatment, not fictionalization into entertainment narratives with revenge arcs and engagement hooks. I'd be happy to help you with alternatives. An original fictional bear attack survival story. I could create a completely fictional character and scenario following your structure, focusing on wilderness survival, human versus nature conflict, and themes of resilience. A different justice narrative premise, using your excellent structure, but with a completely fictional scenario about bullying, institutional corruption, and redemption that doesn't involve real deaths. A cryptid encounter story. Given your work with Bigfoot narratives, I could create an original creature encounter story with your specified character count and continuous prose format. Would any of these alternatives work for your YouTube channel content? I'm ready to create the 120,000 character continuous narrative you need, just with a premise that doesn't involve a real person's death. The scream that tore through the Alaskan wilderness was unlike anything the soldiers had heard in all their training, all their drills, all their worst nightmares about what war might bring. Private First Class Derek Ashford, who had spent the last 3 weeks tormenting every weaker man in the convoy, who had stolen rations and blamed others, who had humiliated and brutalized with the casual cruelty of someone who believed himself untouchable, now shrieked like a child as 800 pounds of enraged grizzly bear closed massive jaws around his shoulder and began to drag him into the tree line. His polished boots, the ones he'd made other men shine while he watched and laughed, kicked uselessly at the frozen ground. His perfectly pressed uniform, maintained by soldiers he'd forced into servitude, tore like paper under claws that had evolved to rip through caribou hide and muscle. Blood sprayed across virgin snow in patterns that looked almost beautiful in the dying light of that October afternoon. And the men of the 47th Transportation Company stood frozen with their rifles raised, unable to fire, unable to help, unable to do anything but watch as natural justice delivered a verdict that military hierarchy never would. But what these arrogant bullies didn't know, what Derek Ashford couldn't have understood, even as his life drained into the permafrost, was that this moment was not random chance or cruel fate, but the inevitable conclusion of a pattern set in motion the day he decided that power meant the right to destroy anyone weaker than himself. Subscribe now to witness how one man's reign of terror became his own undoing, how the wilderness delivered justice that cowardice and corruption had denied, and how the truth of what really happened on that remote stretch of the Alaska Highway would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. But let's rewind to where it all began, 3 weeks earlier, when the convoy first assembled at Fort Richardson, and nobody yet understood that some journeys lead not to destinations, but to reckonings. Private James Reyes reported for duty before dawn on October 1st, 1966, with his duffel bag carefully packed and his father's dog tags tucked into his shirt pocket, where they rested against his heart. He was 22 years old, born to a Mexican-American family in El Paso, where his father had worked construction until the day he died in a scaffolding collapse when James was 14. His mother cleaned houses 6 days a week to keep food on the table and James in school, and when he'd earned a partial scholarship to a community college, only to lose it when she got sick and he had to work double shifts at a warehouse to pay her medical bills. The Army had seemed like the only path forward. He'd signed up not for glory or adventure, but for the steady paycheck that could support his mother and younger sister, for the discipline his father had always preached, but never lived to fully teach him, for the chance to be something more than another brown kid the system was designed to churn up and spit out. What the recruiter hadn't mentioned was that the Army had its own hierarchy of prejudice, its own systems of oppression, its own ways of sorting men into categories of worthy and disposable. James had survived basic training through the same grit that had carried him through poverty, through racism, through his father's death and his mother's illness, by keeping his head down, working harder than anyone else, and never giving the sergeants a reason to remember his name. He'd learned to fold his uniforms with hospital corners sharp enough to cut, to polish his boots until they reflected like mirrors, to field strip and reassemble an M14 rifle in complete darkness. He'd learned to endure insults and slurs with his face blank and his hands steady, because fighting back meant punishment, and punishment meant less money sent home. His mother had taught him that dignity wasn't about how others treated you, but about how you treated yourself, about maintaining honor even when the world conspired to strip it away. The dog tags in his pocket were a reminder of another truth his father had believed, that a man's worth was measured not by how much he had, but by how much he gave, not by how high he climbed, but by who he lifted up along the way. The 47th Transportation Company was a provisional unit thrown together for a single mission, hauling supplies and equipment up the Alaska Highway from Fort Richardson to remote outposts and radar installations scattered across the territory's interior. It was the kind of unglamorous duty that nobody volunteered for, a milk run through wilderness that would test endurance and patience more than courage or combat skills. The convoy consisted of 15 2.5-ton trucks loaded with everything from ammunition to toilet paper, enough fuel and rations for 3 weeks on the road, and 30 soldiers who would take shifts driving and maintaining the vehicles through terrain that ranged from merely difficult to potentially lethal. James had been assigned to the 5th truck, which carried medical supplies and winter gear, and his immediate task was to help inventory the cargo and ensure everything was properly secured for the journey north. He worked methodically through the morning, checking manifests against actual supplies, noting discrepancies in a small notebook, treating the task with the same careful attention he brought to everything. Another private working the same truck, a freckled kid from Iowa named Danny Chen, whose parents had immigrated before he was born, worked alongside him with similar quiet efficiency. They didn't talk much beyond what the job required, but James recognized a kindred spirit in Chen's careful movements and downcast eyes, the body language of someone who had also learned to make himself small and unobtrusive. During a water break, Chen offered James half of his sandwich without being asked, a gesture that cost nothing but meant everything, because it acknowledged their shared understanding of what it meant to be perpetually hungry in a land of plenty. James accepted the food with a nod that conveyed more than words could, and they ate in comfortable silence, while around them other soldiers laughed and joked and established the pecking order that would govern the next 3 weeks. That was when Derek Ashford made his first appearance, stepping down from a jeep with the casual arrogance of someone who had never doubted his place at the top of any hierarchy. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of all-American good looks that seemed designed for recruiting posters, blonde hair trimmed to regulation perfection, jaw squared like it had been carved from granite, blue eyes that moved across the assembled men with the calculating assessment of a predator selecting prey. His uniform was immaculate in a way that suggested either obsessive personal attention or more likely access to the kind of services other soldiers couldn't afford, and the name tape above his pocket read Ashford in letters that might as well have been illuminated in gold. He was the nephew of Colonel Richard Ashford, a fact that everyone learned within the first hour because Derek made sure to mention it whenever remotely relevant, and sometimes when it wasn't. His father owned a chain of car dealerships across the Pacific Northwest, and his mother came from old Seattle money, the kind of wealth that opened doors before you even knocked and ensured that mistakes were handled quietly by lawyers rather than publicly by authorities. Derek had joined the Army not because he needed to, but because his father thought military service would look good on his resume when he eventually ran for political office, a plan everyone seemed to accept as inevitable. He'd been fast-tracked through an abbreviated officer candidate program that his uncle had arranged, but some bureaucratic mix-up or intentional intervention meant he'd been assigned to this convoy as an enlisted man, a situation that filled him with barely contained rage. James watched him stride through the motor pool like he owned it, pointing at equipment and barking orders to sergeants who outranked him, but seemed reluctant to correct someone with family connections, and felt a familiar cold dread settle into his stomach. He'd known men like Ashford before, men who mistook privilege for virtue and believed that their position gave them not just authority, but the right to inflict suffering for entertainment. The convoy's commanding officer was Captain Harold Morrison, a career soldier in his late 40s, who wore his exhaustion like a second uniform. He had the look of a man counting days until retirement, someone who had learned that the easiest path through military bureaucracy was to avoid making waves. Avoid confronting power, avoid doing anything that might attract attention from people who could damage his pension. During the pre-departure briefing, Morrison outlined the route with mechanical precision, noting potential hazards like weather and road conditions, but saying nothing about interpersonal conduct or unit cohesion. James noticed how Morrison's eyes slid past Ashford without really seeing him, how the captain seemed to recognize and accept the implicit understanding that some soldiers existed outside the normal chain of command. The only person who seemed immune to Ashford's aura of untouchability was Sergeant First Class Maria Torres, a compact woman of Puerto Rican descent who had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a combat medic before rotating stateside to train other medics. She was in her mid-30s, with iron-gray streaks in her black hair and eyes that had seen too much death to be impressed by wealth or connections. Torres would be riding in the lead vehicle and serving as the convoy's senior non-commissioned officer, and during her portion of the briefing, she looked directly at Ashford when she emphasized that every soldier would pull their weight, follow orders regardless of who their relatives were, and maintain discipline or face consequences. Ashford met her gaze with a smirk that said he considered her threats empty, but James saw something flicker in Torres's expression that looked almost like pity, as if she already understood how this story would end, and regretted her inability to prevent it. After the briefing, James approached Torres and asked if there was any additional medical training he should review, given the remote nature of their route. She studied him for a long moment, taking in his carefully maintained uniform and the respect in his posture, then told him to report to her truck at 0500 for supplementary first aid instruction. It was the beginning of a mentorship that would save his life, though neither of them knew it yet. The convoy rolled out at dawn on October 2nd with headlights cutting through morning fog and diesel engines rumbling like dragons waking from sleep. James rode in the passenger seat of the 5th truck, while Specialist Rodriguez, a stocky career soldier from Arizona, handled the driving through Fort Richardson's gates and onto the Glen Highway heading north. The Alaska Highway, originally called the Alcan Highway, had been built in 1942 as a military supply route connecting the continental United States to Alaska through Canada, and while it had been improved in the decades since, it remained a challenging road that demanded constant vigilance. The landscape unfolded in shades of gray and gold, autumn having already stripped most of the birch trees bare, while the spruce stood dark and eternal against overcast skies. Mountains loomed in the distance like sleeping giants, their peaks dusted with early snow that promised harder weather to come. James had never seen country like this, vast and empty and indifferent to human presence in a way that made Texas seem tame and welcoming. By comparison, Rodriguez drove with practiced ease, maintaining steady distance from the truck ahead while watching for wildlife and road hazards. He told James stories about previous convoys, about breakdowns in the middle of nowhere, about encounters with moose and bears, about the time a truck slid off the road during a storm, and it took 3 days to recover the vehicle and cargo. The stories were told without drama or embellishment, just facts delivered in the flat tone of someone sharing professional knowledge. And James absorbed every detail because understanding the environment was the first rule of survival. They stopped for lunch at a pullout near the Matanuska River, and that was when Ashford's pattern of cruelty truly began. Danny Chen had been assigned to prepare the meal, working from rations and portable stoves to heat coffee and serve sandwiches to the men as they rotated through the lunch break. It was basic work that anyone could have done, but someone had to be assigned, and Chen had drawn the short straw. He worked efficiently despite the cold wind coming down from the mountains, heating water for coffee and setting out food on collapsible tables while soldiers lined up with their mess kits. Ashford waited until everyone had been served before approaching, then made a show of inspecting his sandwich with exaggerated disgust, holding it up to the light and pointing out some imagined flaw in its construction. His voice carried across the pullout, loud enough for everyone to hear, demanding to know if Chen even knew how to make a proper sandwich, or if they didn't teach basic skills in whatever village his parents had crawled out of. The slur was delivered with a smile, as if it were a joke that everyone should appreciate, and some of the soldiers laughed nervously, while others looked away in the universal gesture of people who recognize injustice, but lack the courage to confront it. Chen kept his face carefully blank, apologized in a quiet voice, and offered to make a new sandwich. Ashford threw the first sandwich on the ground and stepped on it, grinding it into the dirt with his boot heel, while explaining that where he came from, people understood the importance of quality and taking pride in your work. James felt his hands curl into fists before he consciously decided to make them, felt rage burn hot in his chest, but Torres caught his eye from across the pullout and gave the smallest shake of her head. Not here, not now, not like this. Fighting Ashford would accomplish nothing except getting James court-martialed, while Ashford walked away with a verbal warning at worst. So James forced his hands to relax, forced his face to stay neutral, and watched Chen make a new sandwich with hands that trembled just slightly. It was a small moment, the kind of casual cruelty that happened 10,000 times a day in 10,000 different contexts, but James recognized it as a declaration of intent, Ashford establishing the rules of engagement and testing whether anyone would challenge them. The convoy continued north through afternoon and into evening, following the highway as it wound through mountain passes and along river valleys. They made camp that night at a designated pullout, with portable latrines and space for vehicles to circle like wagons from an earlier frontier. James pulled guard duty from 2200 to midnight, walking the perimeter with his rifle and watching stars appear between scudding clouds. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and his breath formed clouds in the darkness, but the cold was clean and sharp, and helped him think clearly about the situation developing within the convoy. Ashford was establishing dominance through systematic humiliation, targeting the weakest or most vulnerable soldiers, and doing so publicly to demonstrate that he could act with impunity. Chen was an obvious target because of his race and his quiet demeanor, but James knew he himself would be next because he fit the same profile, and because refusing to laugh at Ashford's treatment of Chen had marked him as someone who didn't accept the hierarchy. The question wasn't whether Ashford would come for him, but when and how, and whether James could maintain his discipline when the attacks became personal. His father had taught him that real strength meant walking away from fights you didn't need to win, that a man secure in his own worth didn't need to prove it with violence. But his father had also taught him that some things were worth fighting for, that sometimes walking away was just another word for cowardice. The trick was knowing the difference, and standing in the Alaskan darkness with frost forming on his rifle barrel, James wasn't sure he did. Sergeant Torres relieved him at midnight, appearing out of the shadows with the silent step of someone trained to move through dangerous territory. She didn't speak at first, just stood beside him looking out at the wilderness, and when she did speak, her voice was low and measured. She told him she'd seen his reaction at lunch, understood the restraint it required, and wanted him to know that she saw him as a good soldier with a future worth protecting. But she also told him that Ashford was connected in ways that made him functionally untouchable, that Captain Morrison wouldn't intervene, that the system would protect Ashford and punish anyone who challenged him. The best strategy was to endure, to document if possible, to wait for Ashford to make a mistake, serious enough that even his uncle's influence couldn't cover it. James thanked her for the advice, and for her earlier offer of medical training, and she responded by asking him where he'd learned to maintain his equipment to such high standards. He told her about his father, about the lessons in discipline and honor, and she listened with the full attention of someone who understood that a person's history explained their present. Before returning to her tent, she told him that honor was important, but so was survival, and that staying alive to fight another day was sometimes the most honorable choice available. It was wisdom born from experience, and James filed it away alongside everything else Torres had taught him. The second day brought harder terrain and worse weather, cold rain that turned to sleet as they climbed into higher elevations. The trucks labored up steep grades with transmissions grinding and drivers fighting to maintain traction on increasingly treacherous roads. James took over driving duties after the lunch stop, gripping the wheel with concentration while Rodriguez navigated from the passenger seat. Visibility dropped to near zero as fog rolled down from the mountains and mixed with the sleet, reducing their world to the faint red glow of taillights ahead and the yellow cone of their own headlights reflecting off sheets of rain. They were averaging maybe 15 miles per hour, crawling through conditions that would have shut down civilian traffic entirely, but military convoys operated on different rules and different risk calculations. The radio crackled periodically with updates from the lead vehicle, Captain Morrison's voice tight with stress as he relayed warnings about road conditions and adjusted their planned stopping point for the night. They were hours behind schedule and would need to make up time over the following days. Assuming weather improved and equipment held up, and no one did anything stupid that cost more hours. James drove with both hands on the wheel and his full attention on the road, feeling the truck slide slightly on turns and correcting with small adjustments that Rodriguez praised in his matter-of-fact way. This was what James was good at, this careful focus on immediate tasks, this discipline that came naturally because his entire life had been about maintaining control when everything around him was chaos. He thought about his mother back in El Paso, probably at work cleaning someone else's house. While her own apartment needed attention, she didn't have energy to give it. He thought about his sister, 12 years old, and already showing signs of the intelligence their father had possessed, but never had opportunity to develop. The money he sent home every month was making a difference, allowing his sister to stay in school instead of working, allowing his mother to eat regularly instead of skipping meals to make the budget stretch. If he could just get through this deployment, just survive whatever Ashford was planning to throw at him, just make it to the end of his enlistment with an honorable discharge and veterans benefits, then maybe he could build something better for all of them. It was a modest dream compared to Ashford's ambitions of wealth and political power, but it was real, and it was his, and nobody could take it away unless he let them. They made camp that evening in a gravel pullout that offered minimal shelter from wind that had picked up during the afternoon, setting up tents in near darkness with sleet turning to snow, hands going numb despite gloves, equipment that fought back because metal contracted in cold and canvas turned stiff and uncooperative. James worked alongside Chen and another private named Williams, a black soldier from Detroit who had also learned to keep his head down and his opinions to himself. They got their tent erected through teamwork and shared misery, then helped Torres set up the medical tent that would serve as both aid station and her personal quarters. She worked with efficient precision despite the weather, her movements economical and practiced, and when the tent was up, she invited James and Chen inside to review basic cold weather injury prevention, hypothermia, frostbite, trench foot, all the ways that the environment could kill you if you got careless or unlucky. She showed them how to recognize early symptoms in themselves and others, emphasized the importance of staying dry and maintaining circulation, demonstrated proper treatment protocols. It was practical knowledge delivered without dramatics, but James understood that Torres was also assessing them, identifying soldiers who could be trusted in emergencies, building a network within the convoy of people who shared her values of competence and care. After the lesson, she gave each of them an extra pair of wool socks from her personal supplies, telling them to keep one pair dry at all times as backup, and the gesture carried more meaning than the gift itself because it acknowledged their humanity in a way the army rarely bothered with. They thanked her and retreated to their tent where Williams had managed to get a small heater running, the kind of portable propane unit that generated minimal warmth but felt like luxury in the context of their circumstances. They sat huddled together, sharing body heat and passing around a battered paperback western that someone had abandoned in the tent, reading passages aloud to distract themselves from the storm howling outside. Williams had a gift for voices, giving each character a distinct accent and personality, and Chen laughed for the first time since the convoy departed, a sound like something forgotten being rediscovered. James closed his eyes and listened to the story unfold about cowboys and Indians and justice delivered at gunpoint on an earlier American frontier, and wondered if stories like that ever really happened, or if they were just fantasies people told themselves to make sense of a world that rarely delivered neat endings. The third day dawned clear and bitterly cold, temperature having plummeted overnight to somewhere around 10 degrees Fahrenheit. The convoy was slow getting moving, engines reluctant to turn over, and soldiers moving stiffly, after restless sleep and insufficient shelter. James had pulled guard duty again, from 0400 to 0600, pacing the perimeter, while Aurora Borealis danced overhead in ribbons of green and purple that seemed almost close enough to touch. He'd never seen the northern lights before, and stood transfixed for long minutes, rifle forgotten as he watched the sky perform its ancient dance. It was beautiful in a way that made human concern seem small and temporary. The kind of beauty that didn't care whether you appreciated it or even survived to tell anyone about it. When his relief arrived, James returned to his tent to find Chen and Williams already breaking camp, and they worked together to pack equipment and prep their vehicle for the day's drive. The morning routine was interrupted by raised voices from the far side of the motor pool, and James looked up to see Ashford confronting another soldier, a heavy-set private named Tucker, who had apparently been too slow getting his truck started. Ashford was shouting about incompetence and laziness, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air, and Tucker stood there taking it with the resigned expression of someone who knew that arguing would only make things worse. But Ashford wasn't satisfied with a verbal lashing. He wanted a more concrete demonstration of power, so he ordered Tucker to do push-ups in the gravel until told to stop. Tucker dropped without protest and started pumping out repetitions, while his breath formed clouds and his hands turned red from contact with frozen stones. Ashford watched with arms crossed and that same smirk on his face, counting out loud but skipping numbers to extend the punishment. And nobody intervened because Captain Morrison was in his tent pretending not to hear, and the other officers were focused on their own preparations with studied intensity. Tucker made it to somewhere around 50 push-ups before his arms gave out and he collapsed face first into the gravel. Ashford kicked him lightly with one boot and told him to get up, that real soldiers had endurance, that maybe he should skip breakfast to shed some weight and improve his performance. Tucker struggled to his feet with blood running from his nose where it had impacted rock, and Ashford laughed and walked away without bothering to check if he was seriously injured. James felt Chen tense beside him, saw Williams's jaw clench, knew they were all thinking the same thing about how this pattern would continue and escalate because nothing was being done to stop it. What would you have done in that moment, watching someone in authority abuse their power while others looked away? Would you have spoken up knowing it would accomplish nothing except paint a target on your own back? Or would you have swallowed your rage and waited for a better opportunity? These were the calculations that men in powerless positions made every day, weighing immediate conscience against long-term survival. The convoy rolled out an hour behind schedule, climbing through mountain passes where snow had fallen during the night and road crews hadn't yet reached with plows. They traveled in first or second gear through ruts and drifts, drivers fighting to maintain control while passengers watched for obstacles and wildlife. James rode shotgun again, scanning the forest that pressed close to the road, looking for movement among the trees. Torres had told him during their medical training that grizzly bears sometimes became aggressive in fall as they prepared for hibernation, desperate to consume enough calories to survive months of dormancy, and that a surprised or wounded bear was among the most dangerous animals in North America. She'd shown him photos of victims, wounds that turned James's stomach, despite his best efforts to maintain professional detachment, and emphasized that the best defense was avoiding encounters entirely. Keep food secured, make noise in blind terrain, never run if you saw one because that triggered chase instincts. She'd also told him that most bear attacks were over in seconds, the animal making a quick assessment of threat versus reward, and then disengaging, but occasionally a bear would persist, and then your only options were playing dead and hoping or fighting back with everything you had. The stories she told weren't meant to frighten, but to educate, to ensure that if something happened, the soldiers would respond correctly instead of panicking. James filed the information away, alongside everything else Torres taught. not expecting to need it but grateful for the knowledge nonetheless. Around mid-morning, the convoy encountered their first wildlife, a cow moose with a calf standing in the middle of the road and refusing to move. Morrison ordered a halt, and they waited while the animals studied them with bored contempt before eventually ambling into the forest at their own pace. Moose could be more dangerous than bears in some situations, Torres explained over the radio, especially cows protecting calves, and the smart move was always patience over aggression. They lost 20 minutes to the encounter, but nobody minded because it broke up the monotony of driving and provided something to talk about during the next break. That afternoon's lunch stop became the scene of Ashford's second major demonstration of cruelty, and this time, James was the direct target. They'd pulled into a rest area with covered picnic tables and actual bathrooms, a rare bit of civilization along the remote highway. James had been assigned to inventory and distribute ammunition that needed to be rotated from storage positions. A routine task, but one that required attention to detail and proper documentation. He'd set up at one of the tables with manifests and clipboards, checking serial numbers and lot codes while soldiers came by to pick up their allotment. The work was going smoothly until Ashford appeared and demanded to know why James thought he had authority to handle ammunition, whether they let just anyone touch weapons now, regardless of qualifications. James explained politely that he'd been assigned the task by Captain Morrison, showed the duty roster with his name clearly listed, but Ashford wasn't interested in facts. He wanted theater, wanted to humiliate James in front of an audience, so he accused him of stealing, of planning to sell ammunition on the black market, of being exactly the kind of person who gave the army a bad name. The accusations were absurd and unsupported by any evidence, but Ashford delivered them with such confidence that some soldiers started to look at James suspiciously, the poison of prejudice working its magic, as people assumed there must be some truth to charges leveled so publicly. James felt heat rise in his face, but kept his voice level as he offered to let Ashford verify the inventory himself, to call Captain Morrison over to confirm the assignment, to do anything that would resolve the situation without escalation. But Ashford didn't want resolution, he wanted dominance, so he swept all the ammunition off the table with one arm, sending boxes and clips scattering across the ground, then told James to clean it up and recount everything before they left. James stood there for a moment looking at Ashford, really seeing him perhaps for the first time, and recognized something familiar in those cold blue eyes. It was the same look he'd seen on the faces of cops who'd harassed him for being Mexican in the wrong neighborhood, on teachers who'd assumed he was stupid because of his accent, on bosses who'd treated him as disposable because he needed the job more than they needed him. It was the look of someone who had never been held accountable for anything, who had learned early that rules existed to protect people like him and punish people like James, who genuinely believed that might made right and success justified any method. James bent down and started collecting scattered ammunition, counting each piece carefully despite hands that wanted to shake with rage, and Ashford watched for a few seconds before losing interest and walking away to find other entertainment. Chen appeared and helped gather the spilled materials without being asked, and then Williams joined them, and soon half the convoy was helping recount ammunition while shooting dark looks at Ashford's retreating back. It wasn't much, but it mattered, this small act of solidarity. This refusal to let cruelty go completely unopposed. When everything was finally recounted and redistributed, Torres approached James and asked if he was okay. He told her he was fine, that he could handle Ashford's attention, but she looked skeptical and told him to be careful, that men like Ashford sometimes escalated in dangerous ways when they felt their authority being challenged. The convoy pushed north through the afternoon, entering truly remote territory where the forest pressed close and signs of human habitation disappeared entirely. They were in country that had looked much the same for thousands of years, wilderness that existed independent of human concerns or presence. James felt the weight of that indifference, the understanding that nature didn't care about his problems with Ashford, or his plans for the future, or anything else related to human drama. A tree didn't care about prejudice, a river didn't care about power, and that perspective was simultaneously comforting and terrifying. The road deteriorated as they traveled, pavement giving way to gravel that gave way to packed dirt with potholes deep enough to swallow a tire. Rodriguez cursed steadily under his breath as he navigated obstacles, and James braced himself against the door frame as the truck lurched and bounced. They were making terrible time, falling further behind schedule. but there was nothing to be done except keep moving and hope the road improved. That night, they camped beside a half-frozen creek in a clearing that offered minimal protection from wind that carried the smell of snow. The temperature was dropping again, and weather reports from Anchorage suggested a major storm system moving in within the next 48 hours. Captain Morrison called a meeting of all personnel to discuss options, whether to push hard and try to stay ahead of the storm or hole up and wait for it to pass. The decision ultimately was to continue, but increase daily mileage, which meant longer drives and shorter breaks, and everyone operating on less sleep. It was the kind of choice that sounded reasonable in theory, but created conditions for mistakes and accidents, the slow erosion of judgment that came from sustained stress and exhaustion. James listened to the briefing and understood that the next week would be harder than anything they'd experienced so far, that maintaining discipline and focus would require conscious effort, that this was exactly the kind of environment where Ashford's cruelty would flourish, because everyone would be too tired to resist. The fourth day began with mechanical problems, one of the trucks refusing to start despite multiple attempts, and increasingly creative profanity from the driver. They lost 3 hours while mechanics diagnosed and repaired a fuel pump failure, 3 hours of sitting in cold cabs or huddling around fires that provided minimal warmth. Ashford used the downtime to organize what he called training exercises, but were actually just opportunities to harass people. He ran soldiers through pointless drills, making them disassemble and reassemble equipment that didn't need maintenance, checking uniforms for imaginary infractions, inventing reasons to discipline anyone who caught his attention. James stayed out of sight as much as possible, working on legitimate maintenance tasks and keeping his profile low. Chen wasn't as lucky, getting caught and assigned to dig a drainage ditch that nobody needed using an entrenching tool that had seen better days. He dug steadily for 2 hours while Ashford watched and offered commentary about work ethic and whether foreigners understood the concept of honest labor. The cruelty was almost casual in its delivery, as if Ashford was simply passing time rather than deliberately inflicting suffering, and that made it somehow worse because it demonstrated how little thought went into the decision to hurt someone. When the truck was finally repaired and they mounted up to continue, Chen's hands were blistered and bleeding despite gloves, and he sat in the back of their truck with his eyes closed and his jaw tight. Williams shared his first aid kit without comment, and they bandaged Chen's hands in silence while the convoy lurched back into motion. The landscape outside the window seemed to reflect their mood: gray skies and bare trees and patches of dirty snow. Everything stripped down to essentials and waiting for winter to arrive in force. They encountered another vehicle that afternoon, the first sign of human activity they'd seen in 2 days. A battered pickup truck was pulled off to the side of the road, with its hood up and steam rising from the engine. The driver was a native man in his 60s, with a weathered face and oil-stained hands, and Captain Morrison stopped the convoy long enough for mechanics to assess the situation. The truck had blown a radiator hose and was going nowhere without a replacement, and the nearest town was 60 miles back the way they'd come. Morrison authorized giving the man a ride and towing his truck to the next outpost, a small gesture that cost them additional time, but was the right thing to do. The man's name was Charlie, though he didn't offer a last name, and he rode in the lead vehicle while his truck was secured behind one of the convoy trucks. During their next stop, Charlie talked to some of the soldiers about the country they were traveling through, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the land before the highway was built. He spoke about how his people had traveled these valleys for generations, following caribou and fishing the rivers, living in harmony with cycles that the modern world had disrupted, but not entirely destroyed. He talked about the grizzlies that denned in the mountains above them, about how this time of year they were desperate and unpredictable, about respecting the power of nature instead of assuming human dominance. Torres listened with real interest, asking questions about traditional medicine and survival techniques, and Charlie seemed pleased to share knowledge with someone who approached it respectfully, rather than as curiosity or entertainment. James absorbed the conversation while working on other tasks, filed away the information about bear behavior and seasonal patterns. Ashford appeared midway through Charlie's stories and made some comment about whether the old man spoke English or if someone needed to translate, a joke delivered with that familiar smirk that signaled he was asserting hierarchy rather than seeking actual communication. Charlie looked at Ashford for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. then returned to his conversation with Torres as if Ashford had never spoken. It was a subtle dismissal, the kind that someone secure in their own worth could deliver without raising their voice, and Ashford's smirk faltered as he realized he'd been evaluated and found irrelevant. He walked away with his shoulders tight and his movements sharp, and James understood that Ashford had just added Charlie to his mental list of people who deserved punishment for insufficient deference. The convoy rolled on through afternoon into evening, pushing to make up lost time. They drove later than planned, headlights cutting tunnels through darkness, while exhaustion made everyone's reaction slower and judgment fuzzier. When they finally stopped for the night at a turnout near a frozen lake, the temperature had dropped to single digits, and setting up camp became an exercise in endurance rather than efficiency. James was so tired, he could barely think straight, muscle memory carrying him through tasks his brain was too fogged to consciously direct. He got his tent up, got his gear stowed, got himself inside and into his sleeping bag with boots still on because removing them required more energy than he possessed. Chen and Williams were already unconscious, their breathing deep and steady, and James followed them into sleep within seconds. He dreamed about Texas, about his mother's house, and his sister's laugh and the warmth of sun on brown earth, and woke in what felt like minutes, but was actually 4 hours to the sound of his name being called for guard duty. He forced himself upright, forced his body to move despite every muscle screaming protest, forced his eyes to focus on darkness beyond the tent. The guard rotation was essential for security, but felt like torture in his current state. And as he took up his position, walking the perimeter, James understood viscerally how fatigue eroded discipline and created conditions for mistakes. The wind had picked up, carrying ice crystals that stung exposed skin and reduced visibility to near zero. James walked his circuit mechanically, counting steps to maintain focus, thinking about nothing except putting one foot in front of the other. He was halfway through his shift when he heard raised voices from the direction of Charlie's truck, and he moved toward the sound with his rifle ready and his exhaustion temporarily forgotten. What he found was Ashford and 2 other soldiers going through Charlie's belongings, pulling out tools and personal items and inspecting them by flashlight. Charlie stood nearby with his arms crossed, his face impassive, but his posture rigid with barely controlled anger. Ashford was holding up a hunting knife with a carved bone handle, making comments about whether it was legal for Indians to carry weapons like this, whether someone should confiscate it for safety reasons. James understood immediately what was happening. Ashford manufacturing a reason to humiliate Charlie and steal his property, asserting dominance over someone who had challenged him through simple dignity. James radioed for Torres without quite deciding to do so, just keyed his microphone and requested her presence at the civilian vehicle, and she arrived within 2 minutes, moving fast despite the hour. She assessed the situation with a single glance, then asked Ashford what the hell he thought he was doing going through a civilian's property without authorization. Ashford's response was smooth and confident, claiming he'd heard suspicious sounds and was conducting a security check, that he was just doing his duty, and she should appreciate his initiative. Torres stared at him with open contempt, told him that whatever authority he thought he had extended exactly nowhere, and ordered him and his friends back to their tents immediately. Ashford tried to argue, to pull rank, even though Torres outranked him, but she cut him off with a tone that could have frozen the lake behind them. He left, but not before giving James a look that promised retaliation, and Torres waited until he was gone before apologizing to Charlie for the disrespect. Charlie accepted the apology with grace, then told Torres in a quiet voice that men like Ashford were not new, that arrogance and cruelty were as old as the mountains, but that nature had a way of teaching humility to those who refused to learn it from other humans. He retrieved his knife from where Ashford had dropped it and slid it back into its sheath, then climbed into his truck cab to sleep. Torres and James stood in silence for a moment before she told him he'd done the right thing calling her, that sometimes the only thing that stopped bullies was someone willing to step between them and their victims. She also warned him that Ashford would be watching him now, looking for opportunities to retaliate, and that he needed to be extra careful about following regulations and giving no openings for attack. James thanked her and returned to his patrol, but the remainder of his shift was colored by awareness that he'd made himself a specific target rather than just part of a general pool of potential victims. The fifth day brought the storm that weather reports had promised, heavy snow that started at dawn and showed no signs of stopping. The convoy pushed forward anyway because turning back was no longer an option, and staying put would mean getting snowed in for days or weeks. Visibility dropped to maybe 50 feet, every truck following the faint glow of taillights ahead, speeds reduced to walking pace. James drove for the first shift with his face pressed close to the windshield, and his hands cramping from gripping the wheel. Rodriguez navigated with a map and compass because radio contact was patchy, and GPS didn't exist yet, just paper charts and dead reckoning, and prayers that they were actually still on the road. The wind buffeted the truck hard enough to rock it on its suspension, and drifts were forming across the road, faster than they could drive through them. This was survival driving, nothing beautiful or adventurous about it, just grinding determination and acceptance that stopping meant potentially dying. They made maybe 30 miles in 8 hours, a rate that meant they'd never reach their destination before running out of supplies. But Morrison kept them moving because the alternative was admitting defeat. Around mid-afternoon, one of the rear trucks got stuck in a drift, both rear wheels spinning uselessly while the driver gunned the engine. The entire convoy had to stop while they rigged tow chains and pulled the vehicle free. Everyone working in blinding snow, with fingers going numb despite multiple layers of gloves. It took 90 minutes to extract the truck and get moving again. 90 minutes of collective misery that tested everyone's endurance and patience. Ashford spent the recovery operation inside his cab, where it was warm, occasionally offering suggestions over the radio that demonstrated his complete lack of understanding about actual mechanical work. Nobody called him out directly, but the silence that greeted his comments conveyed collective contempt. And after a while, he stopped talking, and presumably went back to whatever fantasy world he inhabited, where other people existed only to serve his needs. They made camp that evening in conditions that approached survival level, temperature well below zero, and wind strong enough to rip improperly secured tents from their moorings. James worked with Chen and Williams to get their shelter set up, the three of them moving with practiced coordination born from shared hardship. Once inside, with the heater running and sleeping bags deployed, they shared a meal of cold rations because cooking was impossible in the wind. Williams pulled out his battered paperback and read aloud from where they'd left off, his voice competing with wind that howled like something alive and angry. The story reached its climax with the hero facing down a gang of outlaws in a dusty street. Justice delivered at high noon, with the whole town watching. It was formulaic and predictable, but comforting in its certainty that good would triumph and bad would be punished, that the world operated on rules that made sense even if real life rarely did. When Williams finished the last page and closed the book, Chen asked what they thought happened after the ending, whether the hero went back to being a regular person, or whether having once been a hero, you were stuck in that role forever. It was a deeper question than James expected, touching on things they all understood, about how single moments could define your entire life, about whether you could ever really go back to who you were before something fundamental changed you. Williams said he thought the hero probably opened a store or became a sheriff, found a wife and settled down, but that he'd always be the man who'd face down the gang, and that would shape every interaction going forward. Chen said he thought the hero probably left town, that once you've been part of that much violence, it was hard to stay in the place where it happened, that sometimes moving on was the only way to find peace. James didn't offer his opinion because he was thinking about his father, about how a single moment on a scaffold had ended one life and shaped 3 others, about how death changed everything for survivors, even when it wasn't your fault or your choice. They sat in silence for a while after that, each lost in private thoughts, until exhaustion pulled them towards sleep. James woke to the sound of someone shouting his name, the voice urgent and close. He struggled out of his sleeping bag to find Torres at the tent entrance, her face grim in the light from her flashlight. She told him to gear up immediately and bring his rifle, that there was a situation developing. He dressed in darkness while Chen and Williams stirred, then followed Torres through the storm to where a cluster of soldiers had gathered near Charlie's truck. What James saw when he arrived made his blood freeze more thoroughly than any Arctic wind. Ashford had apparently decided that the storm provided perfect cover for his retaliation. had recruited 2 followers and had dragged Charlie from his truck into the snow. The old man was on his knees with blood on his face, and Ashford was standing over him with that knife, the one with the carved bone handle, demanding that Charlie admit he was planning to attack the convoy, that he confessed to being a threat. It was theater of the most grotesque kind, Ashford playing out some fantasy of authority while an innocent man bled in the snow. Torres moved forward immediately, her voice cutting through the storm with the kind of command that came from actual leadership rather than borrowed privilege. She ordered Ashford to stand down, to release Charlie immediately, to hand over the knife and report to Captain Morrison. Ashford turned to face her with wild eyes and that smile that no longer looked charming but unhinged, and he told Torres that she didn't have the authority to give him orders, that his uncle would make sure she understood the consequences of interfering with his work. Torres didn't flinch, didn't back down, just told him again with absolute certainty that he was going to stand down, or she was going to make him stand down, and that his uncle's influence ended where her responsibility for soldier welfare began. For a moment, it could have gone either way, Ashford weighing whether his privilege extended to physically attacking a superior officer, and James quietly slipped the safety off his rifle, while praying he wouldn't have to use it. Then Captain Morrison arrived, finally emerging from his tent to deal with the situation he'd been avoiding for days. He took in the scene, saw Charlie bleeding in the snow, and Ashford holding a weapon, and Torres in a shooting stance, and something shifted in his worn face. Maybe he'd finally reached the point where even exhausted compliance couldn't justify what he was witnessing. Or maybe he simply understood that ignoring this would mean court-martial rather than just a stained record. He ordered Ashford to surrender the knife immediately, to return to his tent and remain there under guard, and made it clear through his tone that refusal would be met with force. Ashford looked around at the assembled soldiers, saw no support in any face, and finally dropped the knife in the snow before stalking toward his tent, with his followers trailing behind. Morrison ordered Torres to provide medical attention to Charlie, then turned and walked away without another word or explanation, and James understood that this was as close to accountability as the system would provide. Torres treated Charlie's injuries with practiced efficiency, cleaning wounds and applying bandages while asking him questions to assess whether he had a concussion. He assured her he was fine, that he'd survived worse, but accepted her ministrations with the patience of someone who understood she needed to do this for her own peace of mind. When she was satisfied he wasn't seriously hurt, she asked if he wanted to press charges, to make a formal complaint, to seek justice through official channels. Charlie looked at her for a long moment before shaking his head, saying that military justice was for soldiers and he was just a civilian passing through, that the best outcome was to reach the next outpost and go home to his family. Torres argued briefly but half-heartedly, understanding what James understood, that any formal complaint would be buried or used against Charlie himself, that the system protected its own and Charlie wasn't one of its own. She gave him extra medical supplies and all the food from her personal rations, then helped him secure his truck and made sure he had enough fuel to run his heater through the night. Charlie thanked her with genuine warmth, then looked directly at James and told him to watch himself around men like Ashford. That cruelty always escalated until it destroyed either the cruel person or their victims, and that survival sometimes meant recognizing when to stand and when to disappear into the forest. It was advice offered with the weight of lived experience, and James accepted it with respect he couldn't quite articulate. After Charlie was settled, Torres gathered James and several other soldiers and told them straight out that Ashford was confined to quarters, but that enforcement of that confinement depended on Captain Morrison, and Morrison had proven himself unreliable. She told them to watch each other's backs, to never be alone if they could help it, to document anything suspicious, and report directly to her. She also told them that this convoy had maybe 5 days left before reaching its destination, that the best strategy was survival until they were back in proper civilization, where chain of command functioned correctly. Nobody asked what would happen if Ashford violated his confinement, or if Morrison refused to enforce consequences, because everyone already knew the answer. They dispersed to their tents with weapons nearby, and awareness that the danger now came not from environment, but from within their own unit. The storm blew itself out overnight, leaving behind 3 feet of fresh snow, and a landscape transformed into something alien and beautiful. The convoy spent the morning digging out vehicles and clearing a path forward, collective labor that required everyone's participation, including Ashford, who worked with bad grace and constant complaints. James avoided him as much as possible, focusing on his assigned tasks and maintaining awareness of Ashford's location at all times. The tension in the convoy had shifted from background stress to active threat, everyone moving with the kind of hypervigilance that came from knowing the danger was real and proximate. They finally got moving around noon, crawling through snow that the lead truck had to break trail through while the others followed in its path. Progress was measured in miles per hour rather than miles traveled, and the knowledge that they were still days from their destination weighed on everyone. That afternoon, Charlie's radiator hose failed again, the patched repair giving up under strain, and Morrison made the decision to leave the truck behind and have Charlie ride with the convoy the rest of the way. It was the practical choice, but it meant abandoning Charlie's vehicle and all his tools to the elements, a loss that probably represented a significant portion of his assets. Charlie accepted the decision without protest, gathered what he could carry, and climbed into one of the trucks with the same stoic dignity he'd maintained throughout this entire ordeal. They pushed on through afternoon into evening, and James drove with automatic precision, while his mind wandered to questions about justice and power and whether systems designed to oppress could ever deliver fairness. The seventh day brought clearer weather and easier driving, the road descending from mountain passes into broader valleys where snow depth was less severe. They made better time, covering ground that restored some of Morrison's optimism about reaching their destination on schedule. During a midday break, Charlie approached James and asked if he'd walk with him briefly away from the convoy. James checked with Torres first, got her approval, then followed Charlie along the tree line while keeping the vehicles in sight. Charlie stopped after 100 yards and stood looking at the forest, then spoke without turning to face James. He said he'd seen a lot in his years, had watched young men go off to war and come back changed, or not come back at all, had observed how power corrupted some people while ennobling others. He said that James reminded him of his own son who died in Korea. Same careful movements and thoughtful eyes, same quality of paying attention to things that others overlooked. He told James that men like Ashford were wounded in ways that made them dangerous, that privilege without responsibility created monsters, but that eventually the wilderness claimed all arrogance and returned it to Earth. He said that the mountains had their own justice, slower than human law, but more certain, and that James should remember that sometimes the best way to survive was to let nature handle what humans couldn't or wouldn't. It was cryptic advice, delivered with the weight of prophecy, and James wasn't entirely sure what Charlie meant, but he nodded and thanked him for the words. They walked back to the convoy in silence, and James noticed that Ashford was watching them from beside his vehicle, his expression calculating. That evening at dinner, Ashford made a point of asking loudly whether anyone else was concerned about James spending private time with the civilian, whether fraternization with potential security threats was appropriate, whether someone should investigate James's loyalty. It was a transparent attempt to deflect attention from his own crimes by creating suspicion around James, and nobody took the bait, but the accusation hung in the air like smoke from their cooking fires. James ignored it because Torres had taught him that responding to baseless accusations gave them power they didn't deserve, that silence and confidence were better responses than defensive explanations. But he also understood that Ashford had just escalated again, moving from physical attacks on others to attempting character assassination of James specifically, and that this pattern would continue until something broke. The eighth day marked their entry into truly remote wilderness. Leaving behind the last traces of regular maintenance on the Alaska Highway, the road became a suggestion rather than a fact. 2 ruts through forest, where passage was possible if you were willing to accept punishment to your vehicle and your body. They traveled in low gear, with drivers fighting steering wheels and passengers bracing against impacts that came without warning or mercy. It was the kind of driving that destroyed equipment and exhausted humans. And by mid-afternoon, 2 trucks had blown tires that needed changing despite cold, that made tools brittle and fingers clumsy. James helped with 1 tire change, working alongside Williams and Rodriguez to break lug nuts free and wrestle frozen rubber onto frozen steel. The work warmed him despite the temperature, physical labor that engaged muscles and mind without requiring complex thought. When they got the wheel mounted and the truck lowered back to the ground, Rodriguez clapped James on the shoulder and told him he was good people, a simple statement of approval that meant more than elaborate praise. They mounted up and continued forward, and James felt a moment of simple satisfaction at having contributed something concrete and useful. That evening, they made camp in a clearing beside a small creek that ran dark and fast between ice-crusted banks. Torres called James to her tent after dinner and told him she'd been watching Ashford closely, that his behavior suggested someone who was coming unraveled, whose grip on reality was slipping in ways that made him unpredictable and possibly more dangerous. She told James to trust his instincts, to remove himself from any situation that felt wrong, and to remember that survival trumped honor when the two conflicted. She also told him something surprising, that she'd filed formal reports about Ashford's conduct through proper channels, that those reports would be waiting when the convoy reached its destination, that consequences were coming even if they weren't visible yet. It was reassurance that the system could sometimes work even when local implementation was broken, that patience and documentation mattered more than immediate dramatic confrontation. James thanked her and returned to his tent where Chen and Williams were already asleep, their trust in him evident in their complete relaxation. And he lay in his sleeping bag, thinking about how people formed communities of care, even in hostile circumstances, how connection was the thing that made survival meaningful rather than just mechanical. The 9th day brought them to a fueling station, an isolated outpost where the military maintained supplies for convoys and aircraft. It was the first human habitation they'd seen in days, a cluster of buildings and fuel tanks surrounded by forest. The personnel at the station were a mixed group of soldiers and civilians who maintained operations year-round in near-total isolation, and they greeted the convoy with the kind of enthusiasm that came from being starved for new faces and news from the outside world. Morrison gave everyone 4 hours of rest, while trucks were serviced and supplies were replenished. 4 hours to eat hot food and sleep in actual buildings with heat and electricity. It felt like luxury beyond measure, and James stood in a real shower with hot water for 20 minutes, simply because he could, watching dirt and stress swirl down the drain while steam filled the room. Clean and fed and wearing fresh clothes from his duffel, he felt almost human again, the accumulated fatigue and tension of the past 9 days not gone, but at least acknowledged and partially addressed. He found Chen and Williams in a rec room with other soldiers, everyone gathered around a television that was showing the evening news from Anchorage on a several days delay. The images of the outside world seemed strange and distant, people in suits talking about politics and war in Vietnam and civil rights protests, problems that felt both urgent and completely irrelevant to their current reality. During a break in the news, one of the station personnel mentioned that they'd heard reports of increased grizzly activity in the area over the past week, several sightings near the road, and one incident where a bear had torn open a storage shed looking for food. He said the animals were more aggressive than usual, probably because the early storms had disrupted their feeding patterns, and that anyone traveling the highway should be extra cautious about food storage and bathroom breaks. Torres asked specific questions about the sightings, where and when, and what the bear's behavior had been, and the station personnel pulled out a map and marked locations. Most of the sightings were within 50 miles of their current position, clustered around areas where the road passed through dense forest with good bear habitat. Torres studied the map with the kind of focus James had learned to recognize, her mind already planning and preparing for potential encounters. She thanked the station personnel for the information, then gathered the convoy's soldiers for a briefing about bear safety protocols. Review everything Charlie had told them, review everything she'd taught about avoiding encounters, review emergency procedures if someone was attacked, make noise when away from vehicles, never approach a bear for any reason, never run, and if charged either play dead or fight depending on the species and situation. It was information they'd all heard before, but Torres's emphasis suggested she considered the threat real and immediate. Ashford sat in the back during the briefing, with his arms crossed and that smirk back on his face, and at one point he made a comment about whether they should be more worried about bears or about certain soldiers who seemed overly friendly with suspicious civilians. Torres shut him down immediately, but the fact that he'd violated his supposed confinement to attend the briefing and felt comfortable making accusations in front of witnesses suggested that Morrison's authority had completely eroded, or Morrison was actively protecting him. Either way, it meant the danger from Ashford was no longer theoretical or potential, but certain and immediate. They rolled out from the fueling station at dawn on the 10th day with topped-off tanks and renewed supplies. Their destination now may be 3 or 4 days ahead, depending on conditions. The road continued through dense forest, climbing and descending ridges that offered occasional spectacular views of valleys and distant mountains. It was beautiful country in the morning light, gold and white and endless green, the kind of landscape that made you understand why people called this place the last frontier. They made good time through the morning, covering ground efficiently while road conditions allowed, and spirits improved with the understanding that they'd crossed some threshold and were now on the downslope toward completion. During a bathroom break at a pullout near midday, James stood at the tree line relieving himself while keeping an eye on the forest beyond. The trees here grew thick and close, spruce and pine creating shadows, even in direct sunlight, the kind of terrain where something could be 10 feet away and invisible until it decided to move. He finished quickly and was buttoning his pants when he heard something large moving through the undergrowth, branches snapping and leaves crunching under weight. He froze and listened, heard the sound of breathing that was too deep and too deliberate to be wind, saw movement in the shadows that resolved into a shape his brain initially refused to process as a bear because it was so massive. The grizzly emerged from the forest maybe 40 feet away, standing upright on hind legs to reach 8 or 9 feet tall, its head swinging back and forth as it tested the air for scents. James remembered Torres's instructions, stayed absolutely still, avoided eye contact while keeping the bear in his peripheral vision. Time stretched in the way it does during moments of extreme fear, seconds becoming elastic and infinite. The bear dropped to all fours and took 2 steps toward him, close enough now that James could see the silver tips of its fur that gave grizzlies their name, could see the muscles bunch and shift under the hide, could smell the wild musk that meant predator and danger and death. He wanted to run with every fiber of his being, wanted to scream, wanted to do anything except stand there while a creature that could kill him with a single swipe of its paw decided whether he was worth the effort. But he stayed frozen, barely breathing, praying to gods he wasn't sure he believed in. The bear studied him for what felt like hours, but was probably 30 seconds, then huffed once and turned away, ambling back into the forest with the casual indifference of an apex predator that had assessed a threat and found it wanting. James waited until he couldn't hear it anymore before walking very slowly and carefully back to the convoy, his legs shaking and his heart trying to escape through his chest. Torres saw his face and immediately knew something had happened, pulled him aside, and listened while he described the encounter. She told him he'd done everything right, that the bear had probably been as surprised as he was, and had decided to avoid conflict, but that this confirmed her concern about increased bear activity and meant everyone needed to be extra vigilant. She called Morrison over and reported the sighting, recommended implementing stricter protocols about soldiers leaving vehicles, but Morrison waved her off with irritation and told her they couldn't let every animal sighting dictate operations. It was a decision that would haunt him later, the moment where he could have changed what was coming and chose convenience over caution. The convoy continued through afternoon with James driving and his hands still not quite steady on the wheel. Rodriguez noticed and asked if he was okay, and James told him about the bear encounter in clipped sentences that didn't quite capture the visceral terror of the moment. Rodriguez whistled low and said James had gotten lucky, that grizzlies this time of year were unpredictable and desperate, that standing still had probably saved his life because running would have triggered a chase response. They drove in silence for a while after that, both men aware that they were traveling through country that belonged to creatures who didn't recognize human dominance or accept human rules. That evening, they camped in a large pullout with good sightlines and minimal cover nearby, Morrison finally implementing some basic security protocols. Torres organized the camp layout personally, ensuring tents were clustered for mutual protection, and that food storage was well away from sleeping areas. She also doubled the guard rotation and made sure everyone understood they were not to leave camp alone for any reason. The night passed quietly, except for wind and the occasional cry of a hunting owl, and James slept poorly despite exhaustion, his dreams full of teeth and claws, and running through forests where the trees moved to block his escape. He woke before his guard shift, feeling unrested and anxious, the accumulated stress of the journey finally exceeding his ability to process and contain it. When Torres came to brief him before his watch, she took one look at his face and asked if he needed to sit this one out, if he wanted someone else to take his shift. James refused immediately because accepting help felt like weakness, like admitting defeat. But Torres just studied him with those eyes that had seen too much death and told him that knowing your limits was strength, not weakness, that asking for help was often the bravest thing you could do. She didn't force the issue, just made sure he had coffee and made him promise to call if anything felt wrong, and her care broke something loose in James's chest that he'd been holding tight for too long. He thanked her with a voice that almost broke, and she squeezed his shoulder before disappearing into darkness to check on other soldiers. The 11th day was Sunday, James realized as they broke camp. Though days of the week had largely lost meaning in the context of their journey, they'd been on the road for almost 2 weeks, had traveled maybe 500 miles through some of the most remote and hostile terrain on the continent, and had maybe 2 or 3 days left before reaching their destination. The end was close enough to taste, but still far enough away that celebration felt premature and dangerous. They rolled out just after dawn, with frost covering everything, and breath-forming clouds that dissipated slowly in still air. The road that morning followed a river valley, relatively flat terrain that allowed faster progress and gave drivers' worn nerves a break from constant navigation challenges. James rode passenger and watched the landscape scroll past, thinking about nothing in particular, letting his mind rest. Around mid-morning, they encountered a ranger station, a small building beside the road that served as a checkpoint and information center. Morrison stopped to check in and get updates on road conditions ahead, and while trucks idled, soldiers stretched and took advantage of the break. James was standing beside his vehicle drinking coffee when Ashford approached. The first time he'd come near James since the incident with Charlie. He stood too close, invading personal space in the way bullies did to assert dominance, and asked in a voice loud enough for others to hear if James had enjoyed his little nature encounter yesterday, whether he'd pissed himself when he saw the bear. The question was designed to humiliate, to strip away whatever dignity James might have gained from surviving the encounter, and James felt rage flare hot and immediate. But he also remembered Torres's lessons, remembered Charlie's advice, remembered his father's voice saying that real strength was choosing your battles. So instead of responding with anger, James looked at Ashford directly, for maybe the first time since the convoy began, really looked at him, and what he saw was someone desperately unhappy beneath the arrogance, someone using cruelty to fill some void that wealth and privilege couldn't satisfy. He saw someone who was broken in ways that made him dangerous, but also pitiable, and that recognition stripped away the power Ashford's attacks had held. James told him calmly that yes, the bear had been terrifying, that nature's power was humbling, that anyone who wasn't afraid in that situation was either lying or suicidal. He said it without defiance or submission, just stating facts the way you'd report the weather. And Ashford's face went through several expressions before settling on confusion, because James hadn't given him the reaction he wanted. Ashford opened his mouth to say something else, but Torres appeared and told him to get back to his vehicle immediately, and he left with that smirk back in place, but his eyes uncertain. Torres asked James if he was okay, and he told her honestly that he thought he might be, that something had shifted in how he understood the situation. She nodded like she knew exactly what he meant, told him that growth often happened in moments of crisis, that he was becoming the man his father had hoped he'd be. That afternoon, the convoy entered a stretch of road that wound through particularly dense forest, the tree canopy so thick that sunlight barely penetrated, and the temperature dropped several degrees. It was the kind of terrain Torres had warned about, perfect bear habitat, with limited visibility, and nowhere to retreat if you encountered one. Morrison called for a brief stop to check vehicles and let drivers rest, and soldiers dispersed to stretch and take care of business. James was helping Rodriguez check their truck's tire pressure when he heard shouting from the far end of the convoy. He looked up to see several soldiers pointing into the forest, their voices urgent and afraid, and his first thought was that someone had spotted another bear. He and Rodriguez grabbed their rifles and ran toward the commotion, arriving to find a group of soldiers clustered around Specialist Tucker, who was pointing at something in the trees and babbling about seeing a massive grizzly maybe 50 yards off the road. Torres pushed through the group and asked specific questions: where and when, and was it moving toward them, and Tucker described a bear that sounded enormous, even by grizzly standards, probably male, probably territorial, definitely aware of their presence. Torres immediately radioed Morrison and recommended they move out immediately, that remaining stationary in this location was inviting an encounter. Morrison's response was dismissive, saying they'd stay the planned 20 minutes for the break, and that soldiers just needed to remain alert. Torres argued, but Morrison shut her down, and James watched her face go carefully blank in the way it did when she was furious but maintaining discipline. She gathered a group of soldiers, including James, and positioned them on the perimeter facing the forest, told them to watch for movement and be ready to fire warning shots if the bear approached. They stood there for 15 minutes with rifles ready and nerves stretched tight, scanning trees that revealed nothing while knowing something large and dangerous was out there watching them. Finally, Morrison gave the order to mount up and move out, and they scrambled into vehicles with the relief of people who dodged disaster through luck rather than planning. The convoy rolled forward with new urgency, everyone aware that they were in the heart of bear country, with an animal that had shown interest in their position. They drove for maybe 20 minutes before the lead truck's radio crackled with a warning about an obstacle ahead, a fallen tree blocking most of the road. Morrison called a halt while he assessed whether they could clear it or needed to find a way around. The tree was a massive spruce that had probably come down during recent storms, its root ball leaving a crater in the forest floor and its branches spreading across the road. It would take cutting to create enough space for trucks to pass, and that meant stopping again in exactly the kind of location they wanted to avoid. Morrison ordered soldiers to break out chainsaws and begin cutting, assigned security to watch the perimeter, told everyone to work fast and stay alert. James was part of the security detail, positioned on the right flank with Chen and Williams, the three of them forming a loose line facing the forest, while behind them, chainsaws roared and men shouted instructions. The work took longer than anyone wanted. Branches tangled and wood dense enough to dull chains quickly. They'd been there maybe 40 minutes when James heard something that made the hair on his neck stand up. A sound like breathing, but too deep and too close. He turned slowly and saw movement in the undergrowth maybe 30 feet away, something large pushing through dense vegetation. He raised his rifle and called out a warning, and the sound of chainsaws cut off immediately. As everyone went silent and still, the forest seemed to hold its breath, and then the grizzly emerged from the trees, moving with the kind of purposeful stride that meant it wasn't startled or uncertain, but had decided to investigate these intruders in its territory. It was enormous, probably 800 pounds of muscle and bone and teeth, its fur thick and winter-ready, its eyes fixed on the humans with the kind of focus that meant calculations were being made about threat versus opportunity. Torres was shouting orders, telling everyone to make noise and appear large, telling them to prepare to fire warning shots, but only on her command. The bear stopped maybe 20 feet from the nearest soldier and rose up on its hind legs, that display of dominance that made it seem even larger and more terrifying. For several seconds nobody moved, and nothing happened. Predator and prey locked in assessment, and James found himself thinking about Charlie's words about wilderness justice and nature's judgments. Then someone panicked and fired their rifle, the shot going wild and hitting nothing but air, and the sound of gunfire broke whatever spell had been holding the moment frozen. The bear dropped to all fours and charged, not toward the shooter, but toward the nearest person, which happened to be a private whose name James didn't know. The young soldier tried to run, triggering exactly the chase response Torres had warned about, and the bear was on him in seconds, knocking him down and whirring at him the way a dog might shake a toy. More shots rang out, but nobody could get a clear line without risking hitting the soldier. And the scene devolved into chaos, with people shouting and the bear roaring, and blood spreading across dirt. Finally, Torres got close enough for a point-blank shot that hit the bear in the shoulder, and the animal released its victim and turned its attention to this new threat. Torres stood her ground and fired again, this shot taking the bear in the chest, and it swayed and staggered and finally collapsed. The entire encounter had lasted maybe 30 seconds, but felt like hours, and when silence finally returned, it was broken by the groaning of the injured soldier. James and several others rushed to provide first aid, their hands shaking as they worked to stop bleeding and stabilize what were clearly life-threatening injuries. The soldier had deep lacerations across his chest and abdomen, puncture wounds from teeth, and possibly internal injuries from the force of impact. They did what they could with field supplies, while Torres radioed for a medevac helicopter, but everyone understood that survival depended on factors beyond their control. The helicopter arrived within 90 minutes, lifted the injured soldier out, while Morrison explained to higher-ups what had happened. And then the convoy was alone again, with a dead bear and the knowledge that they'd gotten off lucky. Morrison called a briefing after the helicopter departed, gathering everyone to discuss new security protocols and emphasizing the importance of staying calm during wildlife encounters. It was exactly the kind of leadership that should have been demonstrated days earlier, reactive instead of proactive, responding to crisis instead of preventing it. Nobody said anything directly critical because military hierarchy discouraged that, but the silence that greeted Morrison's instructions conveyed clearly what everyone thought about his competence. Torres took over the practical aspects of the briefing, reviewing what they'd learned and what would change going forward. No more leaving vehicles alone, weapons to be carried at all times. Anyone who panicked and fired without authorization would face immediate consequences. She also addressed the emotional impact of what they'd witnessed, acknowledging that seeing a fellow soldier nearly killed was traumatic and that it was okay to feel shaken, that processing fear and stress was part of the job. Her words were simple and direct, but carried the weight of genuine care, and James watched soldiers visibly relax, as they understood they weren't expected to pretend indifference to what had happened. After the briefing, Ashford approached Morrison, and they had a conversation James couldn't hear, but could read through body language. Ashford was animated and insistent, while Morrison looked tired and increasingly irritated, and finally, Morrison waved him off with what looked like reluctant agreement. James had a bad feeling about whatever they'd discussed, but had no basis for raising concerns. So he filed it away and focused on helping clear the fallen tree so they could finally get moving. They traveled until well after dark that night, Morrison pushing to make up time lost to the bear encounter and to put distance between them and the scene of violence. When they finally stopped, everyone was exhausted beyond the point where rest felt possible, wired and jittery from accumulated stress. James went through the motions of setting up camp and eating dinner, but his mind kept replaying the moment when the bear charged, kept seeing the soldier go down under all that weight and fury. Chen and Williams were equally haunted, and they sat together in their tent without the energy for their usual reading, just existing in shared space while processing what they'd witnessed. Eventually, exhaustion won, and they slept, though James's dreams were worse than usual, full of teeth and claws, and the sound of screaming that might have been his own. He woke, gasping more than once, and each time, Chen or Williams would reach out and touch his shoulder in the darkness, a wordless gesture of solidarity that helped him find his way back to equilibrium. The next morning dawned cold and gray, matching their collective mood. Morrison announced they had maybe 2 days left to their destination, that the worst of the journey was behind them. But nobody quite believed it because the journey kept proving capable of producing new horrors. They broke camp mechanically and loaded vehicles without the jokes or conversation that had characterized earlier mornings, everyone retreating into private spaces to cope however they could. The 12th day brought them into their final push toward the destination, the road gradually improving as they approached areas with more regular maintenance and traffic. The forest began to show signs of logging and development, clear cuts, and access roads that meant human activity was more frequent. It should have felt safer, but instead felt transitional and uncertain, leaving behind one set of dangers without yet reaching security. They stopped for lunch at a proper rest area, with picnic tables and trash cans, and even running water, amenities that seemed luxurious after 2 weeks of primitive conditions. James was eating his ration when Torres sat down beside him and asked how he was holding up. He told her honestly that he was tired in ways he hadn't known were possible, that he'd be glad to reach their destination and end this convoy. She nodded and told him she'd been thinking about what came next, about how the reports she'd filed on Ashford's conduct would trigger investigations and probably court-martial proceedings. about how James and the others would likely be called to testify. She wanted to make sure he understood that speaking truth to power had costs, but also value. That justice sometimes required patience and faith in systems, even when local implementation was broken. James thanked her for the warning and the support, told her that she taught him more in 2 weeks than basic training had in 6 months, that he hoped he could become the kind of soldier and person she was. Torres looked embarrassed and pleased in equal measure, told him he was already that person and just needed to recognize it in himself. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, then joined the rest of the convoy for the afternoon's drive. Morrison gathered everyone before departure and announced that they'd make one more overnight stop, reach their destination tomorrow afternoon, and that everyone had performed admirably under difficult circumstances. It was the kind of speech that sounded good, but rang hollow given everything that had happened, and James noticed he wasn't the only one whose expression remained neutral rather than pleased. They drove through afternoon into evening, covering ground efficiently now that road conditions had improved. As they traveled, James noticed Ashford in conversation with the 2 soldiers who'd been part of his attack on Charlie. The 3 of them huddled together in a way that suggested planning rather than casual chat. He mentioned it to Torres during their next stop, and she said she'd been watching the same thing, that Ashford seemed to be preparing something, but she couldn't figure out what. Morrison had finally confirmed that Ashford would face formal charges once they reached their destination, that his uncle's protection only extended so far, and attempted assault of a civilian crossed that line. Torres speculated that Ashford knew consequences were coming, and was either planning some final gesture of defiance or trying to create leverage for defense. Either way, they agreed the best strategy was vigilance and documentation, making sure nothing happened in these final hours that could be blamed on victims rather than perpetrators. They made camp that evening in a designated pullout that had permanent facilities, the last stop before reaching their destination. The site had actual bathrooms with doors and sinks, a luxury everyone appreciated after 2 weeks of field latrines. It also had cleared areas that made security easier, good sightlines, and established perimeters that reduced the constant vigilance required in more remote locations. James pulled early evening guard duty, walking his circuit, while sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost absurdly beautiful after everything they'd experienced. He was thinking about home, about seeing his mother and sister, about whether this journey had changed him in ways that would be visible or only internal, when he heard raised voices from near the tree line. He moved toward the sound with his rifle ready and his senses alert, arrived to find Ashford and his 2 followers confronting Chen, who had apparently gone to use the bathroom and was now backed against a building with nowhere to retreat. Ashford was saying something about unfinished business, about people who didn't know their place, and James understood immediately that this was the final move Torres had worried about, Ashford's last attempt to assert dominance before accountability arrived. James called out for Ashford to step back, his voice carrying the kind of command Torres had taught him, and Ashford turned with a smile that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with anticipation. He told James that this didn't concern him, that he should walk away if he knew what was good for him, but James planted his feet and repeated the order to step back. Ashford laughed and asked what James planned to do, whether he was really stupid enough to point a weapon at a superior officer. And James realized they'd reached the moment his father had talked about, when walking away became cowardice rather than wisdom. He didn't point his rifle at Ashford, but he didn't lower it either, just held it in a ready position while maintaining eye contact. And for several seconds, the situation could have gone either way. Then Torres emerged from the darkness with her sidearm drawn and told Ashford he had exactly 5 seconds to return to his tent, or she'd place him in physical restraints and file additional charges. Ashford tried to bluff, started to argue about authority and jurisdiction, but Torres just started counting, and her tone made clear she wasn't bluffing. Ashford backed down at 3, retreated with his followers while promising this wasn't over, and Torres waited until they were gone before holstering her weapon. She asked Chen if he was okay, got confirmation, then turned to James and told him he'd done exactly right, that standing ground without escalating was the mark of real discipline. She also told him to spread the word that nobody was to go anywhere alone for the rest of the night, that they were hours from safety, and everyone needed to maintain vigilance for just a little longer. The convoy's final morning began with fog so thick that visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet, the world reduced to gray shadows and muted sounds. Morrison called a brief delay to wait for conditions to improve, telling everyone to stay near vehicles and remain alert. James stood beside his truck drinking coffee and watching shapes move through the mist. Other soldiers preparing for the day's drive, and felt a strange mixture of relief and melancholy. Relief that this difficult journey was almost over, melancholy that he'd missed the intense bonds forged through shared hardship. He'd arrived at Fort Richardson as a solitary person who trusted no one and expected nothing, but he was leaving with friends and mentors, and the understanding that community mattered more than individualism. Chen appeared out of the fog and thanked James for the previous night, said he didn't know what would have happened if James hadn't intervened. James told him that people watching out for each other was just what humans did when systems failed, that Chen would have done the same for him. They stood together in comfortable silence until the fog began to lift, revealing a landscape that looked almost familiar after 2 weeks of wilderness. The convoy formed up and began its final push, rolling through country that showed increasing signs of civilization, more traffic on the road, and actual buildings visible from the highway. They were maybe 4 hours from their destination when Morrison called an unscheduled stop at a pullout where another military vehicle was waiting. A colonel emerged and spoke briefly with Morrison, then addressed the entire convoy to inform them that the soldier who'd been attacked by the bear had succumbed to his injuries at the hospital in Anchorage, that his family had been notified and services would be scheduled. The news hit hard, even though everyone had expected it, confirmation that their journey had cost a life and that survival was never guaranteed. Torres led a brief moment of silence, then told everyone to mount up because the best thing they could do now was complete the mission in his memory. They drove the final hours in subdued mood, processing loss while anticipating arrival. Their destination turned out to be a radar installation on a hilltop overlooking miles of forest, one of several facilities that formed part of the Cold War early warning system. They arrived in early afternoon with all vehicles intact and cargo secure. Technically a successful mission, despite everything that had happened. Morrison reported to the base commander, while soldiers began unloading supplies and equipment, the routine labor providing distraction from emotional processing. James worked steadily through the afternoon, helping inventory and stow materials, focusing on immediate tasks rather than thinking about what would come next. When the work was finally complete and the convoy was officially dismissed, Torres gathered James and several others and told them that formal proceedings against Ashford would begin within days, that military investigators would want statements from everyone, that the path ahead would require courage and honesty. She told them she was proud of how they'd conducted themselves, that they'd maintained honor when it would have been easier to abandon it, that they represented the best of what the military could be. James thanked her for everything, told her he wouldn't have survived the convoy without her guidance, and she pulled him into a brief hug that communicated more than words could. Chen and Williams were there too, and the four of them stood together for a moment, acknowledging bonds that would outlast this temporary assignment. Then they dispersed to their quarters to clean up and rest before the next phase began. The base had actual facilities, including showers and beds, and a mess hall that served hot food, amenities that felt miraculous after 2 weeks of field conditions. James stood under hot water for longer than necessary, watching dirt and stress disappear down the drain, feeling his body begin to relax for the first time since Fort Richardson. Clean and fed and wearing a fresh uniform, he felt almost human again, capable of thinking clearly about everything that had happened. He was lying on his bunk, reading a letter from his mother, when alarms started blaring across the base. Emergency sirens that meant something serious was happening. He grabbed his rifle and ran outside to find soldiers assembling in response to reports of an incident at the perimeter. Torres found him in the chaos and told him that Ashford had apparently tried to leave the base without authorization, had been confronted by security, and had fled into the forest when they tried to detain him. Search teams were being organized, and James volunteered immediately, driven by some instinct he couldn't quite articulate. They formed into groups of 4 and began sweeping the forest in grid patterns, calling out Ashford's name and listening for responses. It was late afternoon now, the sun already setting in this northern latitude, and temperature was dropping fast. James's team moved through dense timber, following what might have been a trail or might have been nothing, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. They'd been searching for maybe 30 minutes when they heard it, a scream that came from somewhere ahead and to the left, a sound of pure terror that made everyone freeze. Torres was team leader, and she moved them toward the sound with weapons ready and senses alert, and what they found when they emerged into a small clearing would stay with James for the rest of his life. Ashford was on the ground with a massive grizzly bear standing over him, the animal's jaws clamped around his shoulder while he shrieked and flailed uselessly. The bear looked up at their arrival, blood on its muzzle and fury in its eyes, and James understood in that instant that this was the mate or sibling of the bear Torres had killed, that nature's justice had found its target, that Charlie's prophecy had come true. Torres raised her rifle, but couldn't fire without hitting Ashford. None of them could get a clear shot, and they stood frozen in that terrible moment while Ashford screamed for help, and the bear began to drag him toward the tree line. His perfectly pressed uniform tore like paper under claws that had evolved to rip through caribou hide and muscle. Blood sprayed across virgin snow in patterns that looked almost beautiful in the dying light, and the men of his convoy stood with their rifles raised, unable to fire, unable to help, unable to do anything but watch as natural justice delivered a verdict that military hierarchy never would. The bear disappeared into the forest with Ashford, his screams fading into distance and then silence. Torres immediately radioed for backup and medical support, organized the team to pursue carefully, but everyone understood what they'd find when they caught up. They moved through the forest following a trail of blood and disturbed vegetation, weapons ready, but hearts heavy with the certainty of death. They found Ashford 20 minutes later in a small ravine, his body broken and still, the bear nowhere in sight. Torres checked for pulse, even though it was obviously futile, then covered him with a blanket from her pack and radioed that they'd located the body. The recovery team arrived as darkness fell, bringing lights and equipment to extract Ashford's remains. James helped with the work because it was necessary, because leaving someone in the forest wasn't acceptable, even when that someone had caused so much harm, because ultimately they were all soldiers, and soldiers didn't abandon their own. As they loaded Ashford onto a stretcher, Torres stood beside James and said quietly that this was a tragedy, that Ashford had been broken long before the bear found him, that systems that created and enabled such brokenness bore responsibility alongside the individual. James nodded, understanding that justice was more complicated than satisfying, that even deserved consequences could carry sorrow, that the best you could hope for was that lessons were learned and cycles were broken. They carried Ashford's body back to base through darkness, the weight literal and metaphorical, and when they finally reached the perimeter, the base commander was waiting with investigators and chaplains and all the machinery that followed unnatural death. Morrison was there too, looking decades older than he had that morning, and when he tried to speak to Torres, she cut him off with a look that made clear she had nothing to say to him that could be said in front of witnesses. James spent the next hours giving statements to investigators, describing everything he'd witnessed from the convoy's beginning to its end. And when they asked if he blamed anyone for Ashford's death, he said honestly that blame was complicated, but accountability wasn't, that Ashford had created conditions for his own destruction through patterns of cruelty that went unchallenged, that systems that protected privilege over honor had failed everyone, including Ashford himself. The base conducted memorial services for both soldiers lost during the convoy, the young private killed by the first bear attack, and Derek Ashford killed trying to flee justice. James attended both services because it felt important to witness and remember, to acknowledge that death mattered, regardless of who died or how. The private service was well attended and emotional, Torres delivering a eulogy that honored his service and mourned his loss, while Ashford's service was sparsely attended and awkward, nobody quite sure how to mourn someone who'd caused so much harm. James stood in the back and listened to the chaplain talk about redemption and forgiveness, and he thought about his father, who taught him that honor mattered more than success, that how you treated people revealed who you really were, that true strength came from protecting others, not dominating them. He thought about Chen and Williams and Torres, about Charlie and Rodriguez and all the others who'd shown him what community looked like when it worked. He thought about the bears, about wilderness and justice, about how nature didn't care about human hierarchies or human dramas, but followed its own rules of survival and territory and consequence. When the service ended, he walked outside into cold sunshine, and Torres found him standing there, looking at the forest. She asked how he was doing, and he told her honestly that he didn't know yet, that processing everything would take time. She told him that investigators had confirmed his statements matched everyone else's, that formal charges against Morrison for dereliction of duty were being prepared, that the convoy's problems were being recognized and documented so they couldn't happen again. She also told him that she'd recommended him for promotion and for specialized training, that she thought he had potential for leadership if he wanted it. James thanked her, but said he wasn't sure yet what he wanted, that he needed time to figure out who he was after everything that had happened. Torres understood, told him the army would be there when he was ready, that some journeys required time alone before you could commit to new paths. The weeks that followed brought the machinery of military justice grinding slowly forward, investigations and hearings, and ultimately court-martial proceedings against Morrison and several others. James testified clearly and honestly about everything he'd witnessed, and the process was exhausting and sometimes humiliating, but also necessary and ultimately satisfying in the way that real accountability always was. Morrison was found guilty of multiple charges related to dereliction of duty and failing to maintain good order and discipline, was sentenced to reduction in rank and forced retirement without full benefits. It wasn't as severe as some wanted, but it was more than many expected, a signal that even career officers couldn't ignore their responsibilities without consequence. The soldiers who'd been Ashford's followers received lesser punishments, reduction in rank, and reassignment. And James hoped they'd learn something from the experience, though he wasn't optimistic. Charlie was contacted and offered compensation for his property loss and injuries, and while he refused the money, he did accept a formal apology from the army and a guarantee that the soldiers who'd helped him would be recognized. Torres received a commendation for her conduct during the convoy and was promoted to Master Sergeant, though she told James privately that the real reward was knowing her soldiers had survived and grown from the experience. Chen and Williams remained close friends with James, the three of them bound by shared trauma that time wouldn't erase, and they made plans to stay in touch after their enlistments ended. James wrote to his mother about what had happened, careful editing to avoid frightening her, but honest about how difficult it had been, and she wrote back with pride in her son and gratitude that he'd maintained his father's values under pressure. The story of the convoy became something of a legend within the army, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy and embellishment. Some versions turned it into a simple cautionary tale about respecting nature, others made it a morality play about corruption and justice, and a few even tried to make Ashford into a tragic hero, brought down by circumstances beyond his control. James heard these versions with bemusement and occasionally frustration, knowing that the truth was more complicated than any single narrative could capture, that real events resisted simple interpretation. What he knew was that he'd survived, that he'd maintained his honor when it would have been easier to abandon it, that he'd found community in unexpected places, and that his father's lessons about strength and dignity had proven true. He knew that systems could be broken and individuals could be cruel, but also that resistance was possible and accountability sometimes did arrive, even if slowly. He knew that nature operated on rules that humans ignored at their peril, that wilderness didn't care about privilege or power, that the bear that killed Ashford was just an animal following its instincts, and that trying to impose human moral frameworks on that event missed the point. What would you have done in James's position? Facing cruelty and corruption with limited power to change either? Would you have maintained discipline and patience, or would you have acted more dramatically and suffered the consequences? These questions don't have simple answers because real life rarely does, but the asking matters because it forces us to think about our own values and how we'd implement them under pressure. James completed his enlistment with an honorable discharge and veterans benefits that helped him attend college on the GI Bill. He studied social work with focus on helping veterans transition to civilian life, drawing on his experiences to understand what returning soldiers needed. He married Chen's sister in a small ceremony attended by Torres and Williams and other soldiers from the convoy, building a life that honored his father's memory while creating something new and hopeful. His mother lived long enough to see him graduate and start his career, and her pride in that moment made all the difficult years worthwhile. His sister went to college on scholarships he helped supplement, eventually becoming a teacher who specialized in working with immigrant and minority students. The convoy's lessons stayed with him throughout his life, informing how he approached challenges and how he treated people, a foundation built from hardship but resulting in wisdom. Torres became one of the highest-ranking enlisted women in the Army, using her position to advocate for reforms that protected soldiers from abuse and ensured that complaints were taken seriously. She and James remained close, meeting annually for coffee and conversation about how the world was changing and how much work remained. Chen became a chef who owned a successful restaurant, cooking food that reminded James of those cold nights sharing rations in a tent while storms raged outside. Williams went into education, teaching history to high school students and coaching basketball, using sports to teach the same lessons about discipline and community that military service had taught him. They all carried scars from the convoy, visible and invisible, but those scars were part of their stories rather than the whole story, proof of survival rather than evidence of defeat. The forest where Ashford died became part of a protected wilderness area, closed to development, and managed to preserve habitat for the grizzlies and other wildlife that had lived there for millennia. Occasionally, hikers reported sightings of an unusually large bear in that region, and while biologists said it was probably multiple animals being mistaken for one, the stories persisted and took on mythic qualities. Whether it was the same bear or not didn't really matter, because the symbolic truth was more important than literal fact. The understanding that nature possessed power that humans couldn't control or escape, that wilderness demanded respect, not dominance. James visited Alaska once years later, driving sections of the highway with his wife, and remembering the journey that had changed him. The road had been improved, paved fully, and widened to accommodate more traffic, signs of progress that made travel safer, but somehow less immediate. He stopped at the fueling station where they'd received warnings about bear activity, found it automated now, with no personnel present, and felt both nostalgia and relief that future convoys wouldn't face the same challenges. He stood at the tree line where he'd encountered the grizzly those years ago, that moment when time stretched and fear became physical, and whispered thanks to whatever forces had allowed him to survive and learn rather than just survive or just learn. The forest looked the same, indifferent to human drama, eternal in ways that made his concerns seem properly sized. He thought about Ashford and felt something more complicated than satisfaction but less than sorrow. Acknowledgement that tragedy and justice could coexist, that consequences delivered by nature felt different than those delivered by humans, but achieved similar results. The moral of this story, if stories like this have morals, is that honor matters more than power, that systems only function when people of courage hold them accountable, that true strength comes from community rather than dominance, and that nature's justice operates on time frames and rules that humans dismiss at their peril. Derek Ashford thought his privilege made him untouchable, thought wealth and connections meant he could act without consequence, thought cruelty was a viable strategy for establishing hierarchy. He was wrong, and his wrongness cost him everything. James Reyes thought he was powerless, thought survival meant accepting abuse, thought discipline meant never standing up for himself or others. He was also wrong, but his wrongness led to growth and learning rather than destruction. The difference between them wasn't intelligence or ability, but values and choices. The decision to build up versus tear down, to protect versus dominate, to treat people as valuable regardless of their utility. These aren't complex concepts, but they're consistently difficult to implement because they require courage and patience and willingness to sacrifice immediate gratification for long-term good. If this story resonated with you, if you face similar situations or know someone who has, share it so others understand that standing against corruption and cruelty is possible even when difficult, that documentation and patience can achieve justice even when immediate action can't, that community and care matter more than individual glory. Subscribe to hear more stories about real people facing real challenges and finding ways to maintain their humanity despite pressure to abandon it, about how ordinary people become extraordinary through choices rather than circumstances, about justice that arrives in unexpected forms and teaches lessons we need to learn. Remember that you're stronger than you think, that systems can be changed even when they seem immovable, that protecting others is the truest form of protecting yourself, and that sometimes the wilderness teaches lessons that civilization has forgotten. The blood soaked through Harrison Caldwell's designer hiking jacket in dark spreading patches as he stumbled backward over the rocky trail, his hands pressed uselessly against the gaping